You're listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition, the last edition this week, in fact, of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, events, and more from across these disunited states and the surface of our increasingly divided globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Right, good morning, everybody. I hope you're having a good morning indeed. Without too much further ado, let's get into the headlines. First up in COVID news, at least 66,362 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday, with 911 new deaths. Over the past week, there has been an average of 62,956 cases per day. That's a decrease of 4% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 27% of the American public has now been fully vaccinated, and 41% of residents have received at least one dose. This is, of course, rounded. That number's rounded, but it's up from 26 and 40% yesterday. So a 1% increase in both categories. That's probably about as high an increase as we're going to see on any given day, unless we have a dramatically faster rollout. But the hope is we're going to see more of those increases on a daily basis pretty soon going forward. Anyway, as of this morning, more than 31,951,438 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, while about 569,875 have died from it. In India, a day after breaking the previous record for the most new cases in a single day, the country has done so again, with more than 332,000 cases of COVID reported today from the country. That's right, 332,000. Yesterday, the new record, and this is not just for India, but for any country in the world. That record was set at about 312,000 new cases in a day. Now it's jumped by another 20,000 to 332,000. They have also seen their own countrywide record high for deaths in a single day. That is 2,263 deaths in a single day in India. Many hospitals in the most saturated regions of the country have reached full capacity and are now running low on or out of oxygen and other supplies needed to treat patients with COVID. One quick comment here, Jamarl. It would be good to speak with a doctor, potentially Dr. Kogan, potentially another doctor sometime soon, because we should be talking about not just what's going on in India, but the different variants, where I want to look into it more, but reportedly India has its own variant, and they're still trying to understand exactly how it differs from the wild variants, from other more common variants, and whether that might be causing some of the increased uptick, or whether, just how it is different from the other ones that we're seeing. Anyway.
Agreed.
Back in the United States, 100%, yeah. Another woman in the United States has reportedly had low platelets and a rare blood condition as a result of receiving the Johnson & Johnson shot. She's an Oregon woman, and she died. Use of that shot was paused earlier this month on the concern that it, along with the AstraZeneca vaccine, could be causing a rare side effect of an obscure clotting condition, specifically cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, which, again, that is the rare blood clotting condition that, as we spoke about earlier with Dr. Mikhail Kogan, a couple weeks ago at this point, a week and a half ago, it seems to be caused unusually by both the Johnson & Johnson shot and the AstraZeneca shot. And the explanation given then was that it had something to do with how those shots were delivered. The fact that they were adenovirus-based, the vector used for injecting the sort of vaccinating agent, this demobilized cold virus that they use to inject the shot seems to increase the increase the risk of blood clots in some women below a certain age. And even then, it's a very rare side effect. But what Kogan was saying was that they're worried that it's going to, as new variants of the virus pop up, of the coronavirus pop up, and we develop new vaccines for those variants, you might see some higher rate. And so they're pausing it until they get a better understanding of it, get it more under control. I still take issue with that decision. It seems whether you're giving those vaccines to the broad mass of the public or even here in the United States, if you were to reserve the Johnson & Johnson shot for specifically like younger men, where older men and older women, even though they wouldn't be as affected by this rare blood clotting condition, it seems like they should be getting the best of the best in terms of the shots. They should be getting the 90+% efficacy vaccines like the Moderna, like the Pfizer, for instance, both of those. But here in the United States, if we set aside for a minute the fact that 15 million doses of the Johnson & Johnson shot were spoiled a couple of weeks ago in a Baltimore plant dysfunctional problem, if we have this vaccine to use, to throw around, it seems like younger men are a good category for it because they don't need the most effective versions of the shot. You know, they don't need the Pfizers with 90% plus efficacy. If it's easy for them to get the one shot and go, then go ahead and do it. And they're not young women who are, again, the demographic that are seeing the worst risks of suffering this obscure blood clotting condition. And that's just here in the United States that I'm talking about. I'm not even focusing on over in the EU or in other countries around the world that are suffering a shortage of shots and could really do in a lot of cases with the AstraZeneca shot. I'm even taking the harder argument, which is that here in the United States, we can still use it. And another side of this,
I respect that. I respect that. Because as you were going, good. I was like, right on, Shane. He's not taking the easy way out. We're going to Europe. He's coming here in the States. Please keep going. I like this.
Well, the other side of this is I get the sort of hesitancy over how, okay, so we get new variants, you redevelop these vaccines to suit those new variants. And if you see a small problem now, there's a chance that as you redevelop those vaccines, whatever's causing that problem is going to grow and you're going to get problems on that end. But the fact is, as far as I can tell, there's not at least I'm not hearing about a serious push to redevelop these new vaccines or those new variants. That's certainly something that I'm sure people are testing out. But it seems like if you were to use these vaccines in more of the population now, you would have and if you were to do a controlled follow-up with the people who got them, you would have a larger sample size and therefore a better possibility of understanding exactly what's causing them. In other words, if this is an extremely obscure condition, you're probably not going to, it seems unlikely to me that you're going to be able to successfully, and we should get a doctor on or even somebody more specific than a doctor, because I don't know that an average medical doctor would be able to get into this. But it seems like you can't just recreate those circumstances perfectly in a laboratory condition with a sample size of only 10 or 20 or 100 patients. If this is a 1 in 250,000 chance that somebody's going to contract this, or a 1 in a million chance with a Johnson & Johnson shot that somebody who gets the J&J shot is going to experience this blood clotting condition, you probably need to have a larger population size to see, okay, this is exactly the kind of person. These are the other problems they had. These are the problems in their genetic code or whatever. This is how the virus seems to, or how this vaccine, who this vaccine seems to like to mess up, that kind of thing. Now, admittedly, that's a little bit medically fraught or scientifically fraught or something like that ethically, because it's like, oh, let's test it out on everybody. And, whoever suffers the worst effects of this, well, we'll know then. We'll know once they die, that kind of thought process. And I don't like that either, but I also don't know what the alternative is. And frankly, it does seem like it would do more to save lives now than if you don't use it well enough. I don't know, Jamarl. That was the more controversial take. Your thoughts on that?
In areas where you have choice, I would basically use top of the line. It's that straightforward. So if you're in Europe, then yes, use AstraZeneca. Now the catch and the question really, from the standpoint of Europe, is not necessarily whether you use AstraZeneca, it's the language around it. That's the issue. So it's how do you explain to the population that there is a consequence in a very small aspect of the population without having that population turn against it because they don't want to be part of the risk. That's the issue. Europe seemingly took the worst tact in this and just shut it down entirely. Because I agree with you on this. I mean, the number of people that are dying in comparison to the number of people that make it ill, it seems so dramatically out of whack that stopping it just seems wrong on some level. But it does seem like an issue of how do you use the political language? How do you use language in order to explain this in a way. I mean, for God's sake, propaganda is the lifeblood of non-authoritarian systems, right? Well, get to work. Figure out how to say
Do
it.
the propaganda. Well, but here's the thing. I think the most effective propaganda in the long run is honest one. Either that, or you have to try to maintain absolute, complete control over every way that people can share information with each other. Because when you try to get a lie across in a broad enough, in an open enough space, at a certain point, some people notice the lie, they start talking about it, and if they can make their case to other people, then what you have is a split system. And of course, that's what we're living in, with Trump calling the media the fake news media, and in a lot of cases they are, while Trump himself lies, and the Republican Party lies, and Fox News lies. If everybody's lying, and just different people are taking different sides, then you have a sort of fractured monoculture. You have a society that used to more or less buy into one way of seeing things, and has now split into many, many different ways of believing which facts are facts and believing which narratives are valid narratives, that kind of thing. Anyway, on this specific topic, how can you propaganda this one or whatever? The honest way to do it, in my opinion, specifically if you're targeting it to young men, is to tell them you have effectively a 0% chance of ever getting this condition. The only people who seem to have had this bad effect come into play are young women. You're not, and therefore you're safe. This is totally good for you. Please, take this. It's easier than the other shots. It's one shot instead of two shots, and this is about all you need since you're young and you're unlikely to suffer the worst effects of COVID anyway. And if you take this vaccine and you do get COVID, you really don't have to worry about any of those. You don't have to worry about long COVID, any of those lingering side effects that some of your friends might have, complained about, even people your age, that kind of thing. I don't know, man. I could see that potentially working. I just don't think our government is nearly functional enough to have the wherewithal to marshal those claims and then make them meaningfully. But we have more headlines to get to. In national political news, the Senate has voted to pass a bill opposing hate crimes. The bill will create a new position in the Justice Department to focus on that issue, and it aims to improve state and local hate crime reporting. The bill was passed 94-1 in the Senate, with Senator Josh Hawley the only senator to vote no. A new panel is recommending that the United States military should change the way it handles sexual assault cases. The independent panel, created by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, is recommending that sexual assault cases not be heard from within the chain of command, with commanders currently reviewing and sometimes blocking sexual assault claims, but that process should instead be moved to a more independent process. Austin will now review these recommendations and consult with leaders in the military. That makes perfect sense to me. This stuff always should have been handled from outside. If you have handling inside, I guess in some cases you have confidential information you need to handle, whatever, those kinds of things. But mostly this just seems like a really good way to cover stuff up. This seems like a really good way to not have to air your dirty laundry as an institution, but instead to have those who have, rank over other people, basically, do certain people favors, keep things out of the limelight because they don't want to attract the attention. They don't want, sexual assault cases can sometimes get pretty high profile. They tend to attract our attention, especially just with the whole gender relations thing in the States being what it is, and fundamentally the gender relations thing in human nature or whatever being what it is. This is something we pay attention to. And so I think from the military's perspective, they're like, let's keep it under wraps. Whatever we can do to keep it under wraps. Hopefully that changes. Jamarl, any take on this before we move to other headlines here?
It sounds like you're trying to undermine the effectiveness and efficacy of our military, Shane. That's what it sounds like.
Exactly. Oh, man. No, there's nothing I'd like. No, I can't say there's nothing I'd like more than that. I'll put it like this. I want a good military. I just wish it were doing better stuff. And I wish we really didn't need to use it pretty much ever. And it seems like for about, I don't know.
No,
it seems like ideally.
But the thing is, they go where they're sent. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like, I mean, there are two ways to look at it. It's like the moment that you have a gun, are you more likely to use it? That's the first point. And this gets to the whole issue of standing armies and that type of stuff. But on the second one, it's like they go when sent. And so is there a way to use the military in a way to the highest ideals? And maybe at that point it's not a military. Maybe it's Starfleet. It's the workers' corps. It's going out trying to be peacekeepers and that type of stuff. But that seems to be fundamentally different than military. I don't know. It's an interesting question.
I hear you. I hear you. A couple more headlines here. In international news, Turkish police have arrested more than 60 people on a list of 78 suspects while cracking down on a cryptocurrency trading platform named Thodex. This follows allegations of stolen money, with the CEO of the company fleeing the country. That move, combined with the government's investigation, has left almost 400,000 reported active users without access to their funds, although I've heard another account that puts that number at about 30,000 people with actual investments through this company. So varying numbers there by over an order of magnitude. Anyway, Thodex, the company, is reportedly suffering liquidity problems with too many users requesting their funds and not enough funds to pay to them. This follows a move in mid-March in which the head of the company promised to pay Doji coins to new registrants to the website. Many users have reportedly not yet received their Doji coins. And I say that with a straight face. A funeral for the president of Chad, who reportedly died during a battle earlier this week, will be taking place in the country. The funeral, that is. It is said that Idris Deby died while fighting rebels. One of his sons, a 4-star military general with the backing of the military, is taking up the reins, with both the opposition parties and the rebels pushing back against the move. And two more quick headlines here. One, in Earth and Science news. Children born to those who suffered the Chernobyl nuclear disaster reportedly have no signs of excess genetic mutation or genetic defects. The results of the study on the disaster, the 35th anniversary of which will be this coming Monday, are set to reassure many residents of Fukushima who are worried about passing on multi-generational defects from living in the vicinity of Japan's nuclear disaster at the Fukushima plant. And in Britain, a new malaria vaccine developed in the country is reportedly 77% effective against the disease. It's far more effective than the only other vaccine available for preventing the disease. This news coming after a test in the country of Burkina Faso. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, and when we come back, we'll be on our soapbox segment with Jamarl's monologue and our short back and forth. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines. Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Guys, if you live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. You can also contact and reach us with a chat, a tweet, and of course, by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. There's been big news in the UFO community this week, and not just in the UFO community. I know you've seen it, the Today Show, CNN, Fox News. It's been all over. I even saw it on Chinese media. Videos that was put out by one Jeremy Corbell basically hit all over the place. A triangular UFO. People talk about it all the time. But in this case, he got his hands on a video that apparently was leaked to him. Now, the catch and the question with these always, is it real? Is it legit? Well, the reason that CNN, Fox News, the China Network, and 1,000 other places was playing the footage is because the Pentagon came out and said, that is real. That is from one of our people who was on one of those ships. However, we cannot talk about it because we do not want to give any information about our capabilities to our adversaries. Something to that effect, I'm paraphrasing. But think about what I just told you. A triangular UFO is sailing over our ships. I believe this one, this USS Russell, I believe in this case. But this was in correlation with a bunch of other sightings on those ships. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I even did the video from the brief that went into the Freedom of Information Act on a lot of the information out that was being released on this stuff. So Corbell releases the video. Heads explode. Oh my God, the Pentagon says that it's real. The Pentagon says it's real. On top of that one, you had George Knapp. They're almost at the exact same time, if I'm not mistaken, on the exact same day, releases 3 other photographs of things floating in the sky. And the question, are they real? Now, the thing that people say is that, well, wait a minute, how do we know that that's not just a drone? Or how do we know that that's not a this or that? Interestingly enough, Lou Elizondo, same Lou that was on Fault Lines, greatest interview ever of Lou, the same Lou that was on Fault Lines, makes the point that says, look, we know what we're doing. If we've been looking at something from the UAP, from the task force, for several years, and we can't figure out what it is, then it is by definition unidentified. Do you think we're incompetent? And again, I'm paraphrasing. We have the ability to get signals data. We have the ability to figure out what planes are flying in a particular area. Meaning we have all sorts of mechanisms, investigatory mechanisms, to figure out whether it's us. And in the context of us not being able to discern in clear terms whether it's us, and this is, by the way, aside from the fact of whether or not it has any kind of weird properties, meaning is it going at ridiculous speeds? Is radar hitting it in kind of weird scattered ways? Is there something that's indicative of the plane using, or some device using propulsion that is not? It doesn't even have to be that for it to be, we have no idea what that is. Now, an argument is often made, well, how do we know these aren't drones? How do we know this is not hubris by the U.S. government in regards to thinking that no one else could have technology? Look, that could possibly be true, and I even give that some level of credence. But there's something that has to be said, or needs to be said, when these guys are basically pointing out, we're brighter than that. We would know if it's us or if it's not. The triangular craft that Jeremy Cabell, that he dropped in that audio footage, people had talked about triangular crafts, but people, from the standpoint, I think this is the first video that they've shown of one. And more importantly, it wasn't just a triangle, they described it as a pyramid. This brings back my pet peeve, or my pet hypothesis about Stargate SG-1, that Stargate SG-1 is absolutely real, and that they're spoofing us by showing us the television show. That's a whole separate video. I'm not going to go into that video. I'm just making the point that Corbell was basically, with leaks, saying this is what they were seeing when they were there, and that there were multiple ships, not just that one. One of the other ships, the USS Omaha. Now, people kept saying transmedium. And it's like, yeah, we didn't see any transmedium ship, buddy. Now, this is the beauty of what has been taking place. Questions. A UFO community that is skeptical of what they're seeing. Whereas mainstream media has been accepting everything that comes out. Pentagon says this. They accept it fully. You might not have been playing to the UFO community, but the people who've been called the kooks, the people who have been called the conspiracy theorists, are the ones that are asking the questions. That doesn't look real. That looks fake. Why didn't they just go and grab it? These are all the questions, because at this point, their question is very similar to mine. Why now? And how do we trust an entity that has lied for decades to all of a sudden come clean? And by my assessment, I agree with Nick Pope. You guys didn't get to have the opportunity to hear Nick Pope, Minister of Defense, but Pope said something that should be given a lot more credence and a lot more attention. When I asked Elizondo why now, and his answer was more so, well, hey, aren't you happy that it's, coming out at this point? I mean, isn't it about time that it comes out? But that's not really an answer. Whereas Pope's answer was, I think something's coming. What do you mean something's coming? They can't hide something. There's something that they need to reveal, or there's something that they need to get this information out in order to deal with the situation. Now, the question is, what is that? Who knows? but the information is being released, and having the Pentagon basically come out and agree that this is legit or that is not. It's not something I've seen before. One of the craft that Corbell put out yesterday or day before yesterday, he put out 3 stills. Now the 3 stills was from what seemed to be an orb or some kind of drone. It looks like piece of technology that was in the air, and then it was a little bit closer to the water, and then it disappeared. Meaning, Corbell is making the point that says, my source is saying it plopped into the water. It went in the water. And they looked for debris. They didn't see any debris. Now, this gets to, again, some of the questions that I asked Elizondo. And the reason why I'm bringing up Elizondo and Nick Pope is because they're subject matter experts. Elizondo ran the project. And from the standpoint of Nick Pope, he was in the Ministry of Defense. So when I'm bringing them up, I'm talking about the people who are actually in the know, the people who, as a flat fact, know the procedures and the processes and the way that they think about this stuff behind the scenes. The video was basically from a leak that he got his hands on, that somebody gave him. And there's always these questions about how much information these guys have. I am almost certain that George Knapp has information that he's just not releasing. It's like, hey, we'll let you in, but you can't release it. Would you do it? Yes, I would. I would do it in a heartbeat. If somebody said, we're going to read you in on this information, but you can't say anything, however, we'll let you release it in 2 years. Yes. Where do I sign up? I would keep it to myself. I wouldn't even tell Shane. That's where I would be. I would tell my wife. I wouldn't tell you, Shane. I guess I'm making the point that this stuff is coming out. And this stuff is coming out in spades. And it seems, on some level, to even be accelerating. And the question is, accelerating to what? The congressional testimony that is supposed to come up, it's apparently, supposedly was June, but I don't necessarily think it's going to be June. Everybody's saying it's going to be postponed. But that report is gaining a lot more credence, not just in the U.S., but the rest of the world is going to be looking at that report. And, you know, as Nick Pope made the point of saying, it's not necessarily going to say we're not alone. It wouldn't necessarily go that far, but who knows, depending upon what they're trying to get. And I am even curious on how far it would go. I mean, the water thing, for example. When I asked Elizondo, are they here or are they getting here? Meaning, is this a situation that you have these craft that are already here? It's not a situation where they're traveling these vast distances. Maybe the distance has already been traversed. That what we're seeing are small vehicles from some base from somewhere. Do you have any systems data? Do you have any data from the standpoint of radar where you guys could see where there's entry into the water? Now, he would never answer that. But that's what I want to know. Because I think that gets to the root of the matter in regards to what do you know? The depths of our ocean are not necessarily explored. So if you want to hide something depending on the moon or in the ocean, I would imagine the ocean, depending, especially if from a technological standpoint, you can deal with the depths, deal with the pressures and everything else, that may be a better place to hide it. But Elizondo even made the point of saying, yeah, how do you know that it's as complicated as traversing space? I mean, you maybe have something that goes from one end to the next. Extreme stuff. No longer science fiction. This is what people in our government are talking about. This is what our political leaders are talking about. And at this point, this is what the media is covering. Shane, what are your thoughts? I wanted to get into NASA and about the Mars thing, but it kind of just ended up here. Look, that report.
Perseverance.
Yeah, the Perseverance. Oh, go ahead. Tell them about it. I mean, they're producing water at this point.
Well, yes. Yeah. No, produced oxygen.
Air.
It's producing
Air.
stuff. Yes. No. Exactly. Producing oxygen with the headline that we reported yesterday being, I believe yesterday, that it produced enough oxygen. It was yesterday. Enough oxygen for an astronaut to survive for 10 minutes, or 10 astronauts to survive for 1 minute, or 100 astronauts to survive for, 6 seconds? I mean, it's a bit of air, but it's not that much air. And but it's cool. And
it's
again, producing this from pure carbon dioxide. It's a proof. It's a proof of concept. And part of why it's useful is that you don't just need air to breathe. It would also be a vital ingredient in rocket fuel. So if you wanted a sort of permanent base on Mars with, a site for ships to land and then launch from again, unless you want to bring enough fuel for both ways, which significantly reduces how much stuff you can bring with you, because fuel is obviously it's a heavy component. It's one of the heavier components of a ship, which are built to be designed to be not just tough, but also extremely light. In other words, if you have a resupply point on Mars with fuel being produced there for you to send ships back to Earth, it makes it easier for you to bring more stuff on your way to Mars. In other words, it's kind of like a logistical necessity once you reach a certain level of efficiency to have that in place. So
Same
they
thing
did
with
it.
air.
That's awesome.
Same thing with oxygen.
What's that?
The astronauts still have, it's like that thing can be building oxygen for years. And then the astronauts come there with that sweet, sweet O2 that was just being built. Also, the testing, like of the little drone that was able to fly, first piece of technology that we had on another planet. And we were able to find like the atmosphere, how the ground and the soil was, how like it was because of how grainy it was, it can create its own magnetic fields when the blades and stuff like that. These type of risk factors that they need to be aware of. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
No, that's NASA's ingenuity. I want to come back to the UFO thing for a second. But have you ever seen the movie The Martian?
Yes.
And for some reason, I'm spacing on the main actor, but like the survival film, basically, with the dude on Mars trying to survive on Mars after he's accidentally stranded there.
He's the one that tried to kill McConaughey in the other movie, Interstellar.
Oh yes, I believe you're right. It's been a lot longer since I've seen Interstellar, but also a great movie in my opinion. I've watched The Martian a few times now. And anyway, the point is, I doubt that we're going to be terraforming Mars anytime soon. But the idea that we would have some permanently manned base there doesn't seem too unlikely to me, and not too far into the future. And this isn't just because of the pretensions and the ambitions of Elon Musk. It just seems like there's a cultural moment where, partly instigated by Musk, where that seems a little bit more feasible. And it seems like we're actively pushing for it. Now, whether more domestic or terrestrial concerns will get in the way is another matter entirely. But briefly, before we close and go to our guest, on the idea of the UFOs, one key thing that I want to propose here is that there are some truly inexplicable, not just footage, but reported experiences and sightings, and not just reported, but reported by people who you would trust to be relatively honest about this stuff. Who you trust to have the authority to describe this stuff somewhat factually and objectively. And I'm talking key people in the military, former CIA directors, that kind of things, with Woolsey specifically coming out and talking about, and again, this is friend of a friend stuff, where his friend had told him that his aircraft had basically been stopped mid-flight in a completely otherwise inexplicable set of phenomena. Anyway, there is some really weird out there stuff, but I'm also going to pose the possibility, in my opinion, the probability, that some of what we call UFOs or UAPs are simply other nations, and maybe our nation, doing surveillance work. Agreed. And that what we may see in that report, what they may be ready to disclose, is that stuff, is the more mundane, the more terrestrial, the geopolitical side of things. But we'll have to come back on that. We want to get guests on to talk about this more soon, I'm sure.
If that's true, that's more of a reason to investigate. That's not less. Like, if it's potentially foreign actors, that's more of a reason. That's more monstrous in weird ways. Like, that's more of a rationale for them to try to figure out whether or not that's true and whether or not our areas. I mean, because if that's true, China, Iran, Russia is invading our most sensitive areas and capabilities. That's a big, big deal. They need to know that.
Right, well, kind of. Well, yeah, no. In its own way, it is a big deal. But the expectation is that we're doing it too. And it's getting SIGINT. It's getting signals intelligence on some of the more important things that you can know about rivals. Fleets, their air force, their naval forces. That whole thing, how they work, what technology they use, how they do maneuvers. That whole set of thought processes is very likely what it would be.
Yeah.
It would be surveillance. It wouldn't necessarily be sabotage or disruption. It would just be sort of long distance surveillance, and maybe even seeing, if these are drones, for instance, seeing if they can be seen.
Yeah.
Trying to detect whether or not they've been detected, because it's sort of double inverted SIGINT or something like that. But you're trying to figure out whether they have signals intelligence on your signals intelligence of theirs or whatever. We need to close though.
I don't begrudge them.
You guys are listening to.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my bad.
No, you're good. No, that's again, and my guess is we do the same thing.
Yeah.
But we got to close this out. We're going to be back on the other side of this short break with our next guest, Peter Oliver, talking about football, or soccer as it's known in the States, as well as Nord Stream 2. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the Deadliest Epidemics in Human History, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are getting into a very rare for us sports segment. I want to take us to a conversation about football, soccer, whatever you want to call it. I'll actually start with that as we bring our guest in. We're joined by Peter Oliver, the EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. You can follow him on Twitter at PeterGOliver_RT. And you can catch his reporting weekly on RT International. Now, Peter, this is probably the dumbest question I could start with, but I'm going to start with this anyway. We call it soccer here in the United States. You guys call it football, pretty much, and I say you guys, pretty much everybody else in the world calls it football. Two questions. What do you call, actually one question. What do you call our version of football? Pigskin?
American
what
football.
Is the American football?
Simple as
Thank
that.
you.
Simple as that. American football or NFL. I spent a bit of time as a sports journalist, as a sports presenter at RT for a while. It was always just NFL. But what we have here, what they would call it with relation to what we're going to be talking about, is around $6 billion worth of business. That's what was the price that was put forward for essentially trying to fundamentally change the way that football, I'm sorry, I'm just going to keep calling it football was managed and ran across Europe. It was the US financier JP Morgan that put up a lot of this money. It involved 12, well, I say 12, it involved 11 of the most successful teams in Europe and London's Tottenham Hotspur. As 12 teams tried to break away from their individual leagues to set up what had been called a European Super League. Now, this caused absolute outrage because what it was seen as is the owners of these various clubs attempting to, in many ways, Americanize European football. What this league would have been is it would have been no promotion, no relegation, a little like the NFL, NBA, the team that if you lose every game in the NFL, you don't stop playing in the NFL, you just go back the next season and continue. Whereas in football, what happens is if you are in the top division in your country, you lose every game, you're out of that division. Football in Europe is a meritocracy. And that's got me in a lot of trouble in the past in the United States. But put it this way, if I like the baseball in the US, if the Atlanta Braves, who are my team, lost every game in the season, they're still going to come back and play in the major leagues next season. However, if the Carolina Disco Turkeys out of Winston-Salem win every game in their league, they play the next season in that league. Whereas, it can work very differently here. The reason for this was abject greed. And it's actually collapsed in a very bizarre moment. It's very rare that we see protest and anger against such large financial interest being able to overturn billions of dollars worth of potential revenue, and that's pretty much what's happened at the moment here. It was a little bit like one of these movies where all of these disparate groups come together. And oh, by the way, it's Matt Damon in the Martian.
Thank you. That's what it was. I could see him. I couldn't think of his name.
But this story is a little bit like one of those movies where a ragtag bunch of football fans, millionaires, vast corporate interest come together and fight against what is really out of this world levels of greed. And they have won for now. But dead yet. There is still a chance this could come back. One of the things that really did for the European Super League, which took teams from England, from Spain, from Italy. You're looking at teams like Liverpool, Manchester United, Manchester City, Real Madrid, Barcelona, Juventus were a major part of organising this. No German teams in that group. And of course, some of the major teams in Europe, like Bayern Munich, Borussia Dortmund, or even RB Leipzig, who are essentially an offshoot from the Red Bull Corporation. That's what they are. But even they didn't join this mass corporate bandwagon, because the rule here in Germany, where I'm speaking to you from, is it's called the 50+1 rule. Essentially, fans own 51% of every club.
Interesting.
49% come from. So you've got Bayern Munich. Bayern Munich are bankrolled by Audi, the car manufacturer. You've got Bayer Leverkusen, who have it in their name. The Bayer Corporation pay for them, and RB Leipzig, financed by Red Bull. But those companies only own 49%. So if, say, the Bayern chairman in Munich was going to say, we're going to join this league, he would be voted out of his position and lose his job.
Peter, that is super interesting. So, how did that happen? Like, that's because I couldn't even conceive of that in the States. Outside, like, that sounds like a worker co-op in an odd way, but it's almost like I can get it. I understand it on some level. Like, it's the fans that make the team. Yeah. Like, you know, when somebody's going to see the Giants, if it wasn't for the fans, you would have no team. You just have a bunch of big men who are overweight fighting, you know, outside in the stadiums or whatever. But it's the fans that do it. So I can kind of see a logic in saying that, well, look, the fans, with all of the money that they spend coming to the games, with all of the money that they spend making sure that we're clothed and we're fed and we're paid, etc., maybe they should own part of it. That's really interesting. But I'm telling you this. They're not going to go away. They're coming back, and they're going to try to continue to do it, just like with the NHS. They're never going to give up that dollar that they can get off of your sports teams. I mean, so, I guess there's two questions. How did that start, where 51% of the team was owned by the public itself? And I would imagine that the people have to know that the capitalists are still going to come back. How are they preparing for it?
50+1 rule, it's been part of German football for as long as we can really remember here. I mean, I'm a fan of Union Berlin. I go and see them. I have pay my membership fee every year, and I get to vote when they have an election on who is who's going to be the club president, the club chairman. This means why in Germany you find ticket prices are very reasonable. You find that you have a little bit more say in how the club is run. Now, my hometown club, I'm from Sunderland in the northeast of England, very different. We've had ups and downs with certain owners in the past. And right now, I'm particularly happy because a certain multi-billionaire heir to the the Lewis Dreyfus company has bought the team. So very happy at the moment with the capitalism when it's going for me. However, what we're seeing in terms of, are they done with this Super League? Absolutely not. Think Sauron in Lord of the Rings if we're going to continue with movie analogies. Yes, they've defeated the Dark Lord. However, while greed exists at this level, and while the money is there to be made at this level, because they have a product that people want all over the world, a lot of the contention, the anger that came out of this was when fans that actually go to games were pretty much dismissed, because that's only a limited market. You know, maybe you get 50,000, 60,000 people in a stadium, but you can get 20, 30, 40 million watching on TV. And it's those 30, 40 million that they would rather be made to pay money for. But you've got two particular figures. One of them is Andrea Agnelli, who's the president or the chairman of Juventus in Italy. He was a big player in organising this league, which you've got to remember, even though it was announced on Sunday, it was finished by Wednesday. It was always kaput by then, but it's been planned for a long time. They have put real levels of secrecy into getting these teams together to say that they were all going to be part of it. There's going to be a lot of lawsuits because apparently each of these teams that's pulled out now owes something around the tune of around $80-90 million at least to the league and the organizations for the contracts that they've already signed. But the other big figure in this, the other shadowy figure, is Florentino Perez, who's the who's the president of Real Madrid. He's insisting this league will happen in some form. Now, the reason it will, you've still got Italian and Spanish teams committed to it, is the Spanish and Italian teams are in financial trouble because their domestic leagues aren't as profitable as the English league. And this is ultimately what it comes down to. The impact of the pandemic, the coupled with the fact that the league isn't as financially rewarding in Italy and in Spain as it is in England. Those clubs are in serious issue, and you're going to... this is why I think you'll continue to see push from particularly Madrid and Juventus, probably AC Milan as well. Actually, AC Milan have officially pulled out as well as Inter, so it's only Juventus still a part of that right now. But you will see push to try and continue this league in some other form. Whether that works depends on what type of punishment these clubs get for doing this. Now, there's a lot of talk about huge financial penalties. There's talk about points penalties in the league. There's talk about bans from European competition. How that works,
you mean really in order to disincentivize the teams from doing it, basically to stop them from trying to go through with this?
Yeah, they need to do something to say you can't try and destroy in England's case, 120 odd years worth of league football. You can't try and do that overnight, but you also need to not create a bunker mentality amongst some of these clubs because
us versus them. Us versus them.
Yeah.
Let's do this. Well, let's take you to the break. The voice that you guys are listening to is Peter Oliver. He's an EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back with Peter in a moment.
Fault Lines.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my indomitable co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. So we've been covering Nord Stream 2 and the U.S. emphasis in trying to stop a sovereign nation, Germany, from basically getting gas from another sovereign nation, Russia. The United States has a weird way about thinking about the world that only applies here, and that the moment that you say it out loud to another human being, they ask, who the hell are you? At least that should be the perspective in regards to the tenor that the U.S. take with some of this stuff. Daniel Fried, he's former U.S. ambassador to Poland under Clinton, of course, in an interview says the following. And because this is basically, we've had Mark Sloboda on. Sloboda has made this argument that basically what is taking place in the Ukraine is not disconnected from Nord Stream 2. That the two are inextricably linked in these kind of geopolitical machinations. And here we have the first heads up about this, or at the very least, very open about this. So what Schroeder did is a disgrace. And right here, I just start from here. Fried said the German government has been making a mistake for over 15 years from the time of Gerhard Schroeder was chancellor. Quote, what Schroeder did is a disgrace. Germany knows it, but we must constantly remind ourselves of the Putin system as a threat to Europe and democracy. I heard the German government will consider mitigating the harmfulness of Nord Stream 2. It should be forbidden for Russians to communicate with Germans over the head of Poles, Ukrainians, and others, he said, adding that the Poles, the rest of Europe, and the Americans should listen to what Berlin can offer. I don't want to convince the Poles to accept an agreement in advance, but consider the offer. Why not? He concluded. He is basically, and right here, a Russian military offensive against Ukraine would make it more difficult for Germany, more difficult for Germany to maintain its current position, he said, adding that the best short-term solution is for a suspension of the work or a moratorium on a project by Germany and a suspension of the sanctions by the United States. That's astonishing. Basically, the sanctions are there to stop Nord Stream 2. Yes, we knew that part. But introducing the war and introducing Ukraine and the provocations that are taking place by Ukraine makes it that much more clear. Because what it sounds like is an ally, a patsy nation, by the way, of the United States, is being used as a bargaining chip to incentivize Germany to either cancel or give up something for a project that they as a sovereign nation have every right in the world to push forth. To have a conversation about this, we're joined with Peter Oliver. Peter Oliver is EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. Peter, this should be a big deal. I mean, where does I'm astonished that this is the argument. That it's like, how dare two sovereign nations talk to one another as if the U.S. allows other nations to be privy in conversations. I mean, this is astonishing. Germany is not going to be okay with this.
Yeah, I can imagine if Warsaw sends that WhatsApp message to Berlin saying, by the way, before you talk to Russia about anything, you're going to need to run it by us. They're going to get a new phone who dis back, because that's not going to happen. This was a speech by Daniel Craig. Daniel Craig? No, it wasn't. That's James Bond. This was Daniel Fried, who really, it's lost a lot of its teeth since it was first made earlier this week, because obviously Russian troops who were stationed in the west of Russia are now moving back to bases elsewhere in Russia. So that idea of building up a huge Russian military action against Ukraine, it was never really going to happen. If you listen to anybody who knew what they were talking about, it's now obviously not going to happen. But what this is and what this shows is that just through any way, every angle, you are seeing the United States looking to try and erode confidence and the ability for Nord Stream to continue and to go ahead. The project's almost finished. It's over 95% done. It's you're looking at around, I think, less than 20 miles worth of pipe that's left to be laid. It will be entering German waters by the end of the summer as things continue. It's currently going through Danish waters on this route from near to St. Petersburg into the north of Germany under the sea there. What you're seeing is you're seeing both the sanctions pressure that's being put on from the United States. You're now seeing these essentially more soft power arguments from former ambassadors that are obviously still very well connected to both the State Department, to the Biden White House, and to here in Europe, talking about basically going to Poland and going, are you going to let them do that to you? Because this is what they're going to try and do. I mean, when he talks about Ukraine being cut out of deals, there's a reason that they're being cut out of deals. One is because that Ukraine hasn't been a reliable partner for a long time, and also that energy infrastructure does need upgrading. But the reason that's a big deal is because that gas transit is worth around $3 billion minimum a year to Ukraine, money that Ukraine cannot survive at all without. And of course, the reason it's in a lot of the financial dire straits it's in at the moment is because of the turmoil in that country, turmoil that was very much openly backed by the United States. Where it comes to Germany and how the pipeline is being viewed here, we've heard from the German defense minister talking about the pipeline quite a lot. This has become her realm, which is interesting when it's an energy project and you've got the defense minister speaking about it. But Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer will be very much happy to talk about anything other than the state of the German military at the moment, with all of the tanks that can't drive, the helicopters that can't fly, and the boats that can't sail. There's lots of problems in the Bundeswehr at the moment. Not all of them from her watch, but it's been under her watch for a while now. Anyway, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer was saying that there may well be a moratorium on the project. Her quote was, whether gas is passed through and how much as gas is passed through, well, that may well depend on that may well come down to the political relationship between Moscow and Berlin once it's completed. This is one of those interesting issues where there is a similar end goal between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. The way they're going about it is very different. The Trump side was very much, don't buy their gas, buy our liquefied natural gas. The Biden administration side of it is more through diplomatic pressure, through sanctions pressure. It's the same result. The end result is ultimately the same. They don't want this pipeline to happen for a number of reasons. One of them is economic. That's why you've had senators in the US like Ted Cruz backing sanctions and really putting his heels in order to make sure that sanctions come about, because he wants gas from his state being sold to Germany, as opposed to gas being sold from Russia. Of course, it's potentially worth billions and billions and billions of dollars.
Peter,
over
real
the next
quick though, this doesn't sound like soft power. This sounds like hard power. No, I mean, they were basically using Ukraine as a battering ram.
You're completely right, actually. When I said soft power, I mean it's more being done in quiet voices behind closed doors, as opposed to tweets saying you buy our gas or you ain't getting nothing.
Well, and this is here's the we only have a couple minutes left, and Peter, I want to ask you two questions following up on this. This comes as just yesterday, Russia announced that Putin announced a planned withdrawal of troops from near the Ukrainian border. As a result, basically after conducting some military exercises in the region, which is of course a reciprocation for moves on the Ukrainian side, again with Western backing, with backing from the United States and Europe, although they're not a part of NATO. We've used them. Again, within the past decade, we did a coup in their country, which, coming back to Nord Stream 2 and how Russia has used Ukraine as a delivery system for their natural gas explains why they might have some hesitancy about the security, the fragility of that country in that economic relationship going forward, and how much they've been used by the United States. But coming back to Germany for a minute here, two questions. One, how has the Ukrainian issue been treated in the German language press, in Deutsche Welle and the other smaller outlets in the country? How has it been portrayed? I'm curious, particularly because, of course, you can also read English and you can see how it's being portrayed in the Western press, which is almost entirely ignoring the actions on the Ukrainian side and always focusing on the Russian side. And then a second question related more to the Nord Stream 2 side of things, with the selection of Armin Laschet by the CDU as their chancellor pick for the elections coming up later this year. How is that changing the political dynamic? And do you think he will embolden the Greens, or do you think he'll weaken the case? How do you see that changing what the expected makeup of the Bundestag will be later on this year? Peter.
Right. Quickly on to how it's being portrayed in the German media. You don't get a job at any senior level in any German broadcaster unless the phrase transatlanticist is somewhere in your CV and used very often in your vocabulary. So it is pretty much quite a similar message than what we've seen in the English language media, that Russia has built up these things. Russia could attack at any moment. Russia is trying to take parts of Ukraine. This is going to be a Russian action. There's not been similar reporting when it comes to the announcement that troops would be pulling away from the border.
That's a shame. And we've got about 30 seconds here. So for the second one, exactly, Peter.
Yeah, on relation to the second part there, what it will do is we're in a very interesting position at the moment, because the Green Party will be one of two things, in my opinion, when it comes after September the 26th election. It will either be a major part of the next government of Germany, or it may well end up leading it. They came very close to topping the polls just this week when they announced their Chancellor candidate, Annalena Baerbock. Armin Laschet hasn't gone down well with the German public. He wasn't the man
That's
they
what
wanted.
I've heard.
He is the man
that's what I've heard.
though.
Peter, we've got to come back on this with you soon. Peter Oliver, the EU correspondent for RT International. Great conversation, as always. Thanks for joining us. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute with headlines in the last 2 hours of today's show.
Listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, your ever-vigilant political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That means you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. For whatever reason, I can't get the order of my intro right. Like either time. Going with the flow, of course, so it's not broken up. It's just jumbled. All right, let's keep going. Good show so far. Peter Oliver, shout out. He's one of the most affable guys that we have on the show. I always enjoy his commentary. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, at least 66,362 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday, with 911 new deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of 62,956 cases per day, a decrease of 4% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 27% of the American public has been fully vaccinated, and 41% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, more than 31,951,438 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and 569,875 have died from it. Those are two uber-specific numbers. I will be one of the 41% come, Tuesday? That will be my second dose. At that point, it probably wouldn't be 41%. It'd probably be a little bit higher, but so is life. A day after breaking the previous record for the most new cases in a single day, it has done so again with more than 332,000 cases of COVID reported from the country, and with deaths also jumping to a record high of 2,263 deaths in a single day. Many hospitals in the saturated regions have reached full capacity and are now running low on or out of oxygen and other supplies needed to treat patients with COVID-19. Now, we need to put this in perspective, and we need to put this in perspective in two ways. One, in a way that is a little bit brighter, and another one in the case that is far, far darker. The United States, we hit over 5,000 people a day at one point, dropping dead in a single day from COVID-19. By the same token, the United States only has 330 million, give or take, a kid here or there, people in the country. So you can imagine that's a monstrous number of people to drop dead in a country with 300,000. Well, India has, 3-4 times our population, 1.3 billion. However, it is a far poorer country. So the U.S., with all of the resources that it has at its disposal, the rich hospitals, the well-stocked hospitals and everything else, that is not this country. And because that is not this country, you have a country that is poorer, that is under basic siege with thousands of people dying a day, and it's far more densely packed. Meaning, I've been to New Delhi, it is very densely packed. So not only do you have a poor country, you have a country that has a higher capacity for potential illness. So this is not a good situation. Even though we may in this country say, oh, they only had 2,000, that is not a good situation. That's the point that I'm trying to make, and this can escalate. The question becomes the vaccines. The question becomes, are there any other methods that could take place? I mean, after all, this is not a year ago. This is, well, clearly a year from a year ago. But you get my point. This was not during the time where everybody was figuring out what COVID was and the numbers were going higher. No, this is time in advance. And you would think that the methods and procedures of dealing with it would be, I don't know, up to a certain level of competence or ingenuity. And in this case, no, not so much. What happens in India or Brazil or Mexico doesn't stay in India, Brazil, or Mexico any more than what was taking place in, let's say, Texas, or what was taking place in Iowa stays in those particular states. And I don't mean to pick on Iowa, I do mean to pick on Texas. Look, there is a world lack of oxygen right now in regards to supply. And you can understand why. At the exact same moment, everywhere around the world was basically trying to pull from the exact same supplies to deal with COVID. The countries that were richer were able to have their hands on those supplies that much more readily. The countries that were poorer weren't. The countries that were richer needed to explain away why the poorer countries were not going to get those supplies. And it looks bad for the richer countries to be fully vaccinated while the poorer countries are just dying off. So they created a device and a vehicle to say, hey, we're going to give some of our supplies and we're going to assist, and this is the vehicle that we're going to do it. But what did I say? That vehicle that they're creating is only for optics. No country is ever going to leave its citizens, meaning no country is ever going to give vaccinations away while any of its citizens are unvaccinated. And the reason they're not going to do it is because the political opposition is going to immediately turn around and say, how dare you send vaccines out of this country when this person and that person are not vaccinated. And that seems to be the case where the poorer countries seem to be taking a hit. Well, in this very specific case, I don't necessarily know if India entirely fits under the mantle of one of those poorer countries, but India is definitely having difficulty right now. Let's keep going. Another woman in the United States reportedly had low platelets and a rare blood clot condition as a result of receiving the Johnson & Johnson shot. The use of the shot was paused earlier this month on the concern that it, along with AstraZeneca's vaccine, could be causing a rare side effect of obscure clotting condition. What is it called, Shay? The plasma acidosis? I'm forgetting the Latin word.
Cerebral venous sinus thrombosis.
That's it. That's it. Thank you, Shay. Look, as we mentioned before, part of the issue associated with it has to do with not entirely understanding the mechanism by which this is taking place. And you can imagine that if you're putting out a vaccine, even if the person or people were getting sick from it, if you understood the mechanism of action, you can, A, better treat those individuals, but you can also potentially weed out why the thing is happening in the first place. This doesn't seem to be happening for all of the vaccines, which makes it even that much more interesting. And so the question becomes, what's causing it? Why is it causing it? Is it really the medium by which it's being transferred, or the mRNA is being transferred? And keep in mind, on some level, the mRNA is still experimentation. We're learning more about this technology as we use this technology. And so all of this stuff is one of those things that we're seeing science as science goes. That's not something that we typically see. We usually see science when it's settled. We see the guys that know what they're doing, the guys in the lab coats who just are certain this is this is the cosmic law of God. That's not what this is. This was sausage making. This was people trying to figure out what is wrong, how does it transmit, what is a way of dealing with it, and doing all of it while people are dying to the tune of 5,000. Science under pressure. That's not something you typically see. Shane, what are your thoughts? Because I know we were having a conversation with Dr. I can't think of his name. His name is escaping me right now.
Mikhail Kogan.
Thank you. Kogan. Yeah, where he was explaining why they were making the choice to pause this. Because, your take was, why are we pausing this? People are dropping dead like flies. There's like 6 people out of hundreds of thousands. This is insane. But he explained it, right?
It was 6.8 million, and now that's gone up slightly, like you were just talking about with this other. I believe you were just talking about it with this other person who died. He did explain it, and just briefly mentioned this earlier on in the show. What the explanation was: we don't know what's causing this. This might be an extremely rare condition this might be an extremely rare side effect to see from this one vaccine. But you also have to understand this is an obscure condition regardless. Therefore, the fact that it's coinciding with the use of this vaccine suggests there's not just a correlation, but there's something that's causing it. And he thinks that the medical establishment wants to get to the bottom of it, needs to get to the bottom of it, particularly because as new variants of the coronavirus come out, and as we tailor our vaccines to fit them, to be more effective against variants coming from Brazil or the UK or India or any other country or any other region of the world, this could get worse if we don't know what's causing it. And regardless, they want to try to figure out what is causing it, want to try to understand the actual mechanism. He said it probably had something to do with the nature of these vaccines. Both of these ones are an older style of vaccine using an adenovirus. And he said that it had to do with the vector of administration, basically the virus that we sort of, I don't know exactly the word for it, the virus that we neutered so that it's just basically a regular cold virus that we tampered with so it wouldn't cause the flu in somebody, and that we've sort of put information into so that it could give people an antibody response. So that then when they got the second shot and were actually infected with, a modified version of the coronavirus itself, you could see a sort of full response to it. That's in the case of the AstraZeneca vaccine. Johnson & Johnson is a bit different. But in both cases, they use an older technology than the mRNA one, which you haven't seen this condition with. Now, I have all sorts of various pushbacks on it, but from my recollection, that was pretty much the explanation he gave. And as far as it goes, it definitely makes sense. And, I understand the caution. Having said that, we are in unprecedented times. Literally zero of the vaccines that we're talking about have been officially approved by the FDA. They've just been given emergency use authorization, which, again, we're in unprecedented times. I'm fine with that. But because of that, I think the weird to and fro-edness of this, the weird being willing to experiment, and then when you have an extremely, extremely rare side effect, immediately recalling or quickly restricting its use, as is the case with the AstraZeneca vaccine, it just doesn't fit with me. And I just wonder what if I could be a bug on the wall, a fly on the wall of the conversations about this. I would be so curious with my limited fly brain, trying to understand why they made this decision, how this fits with the previous decisions they've made, how this makes sense. Because I wonder how much it matches with what Dr. Kogan was saying, which made sense. I wonder if it's just bureaucratic proceedings in the backgrounds, or if they're worried about a PR hit for the vaccines if they don't recall it, that kind of thing.
I mean, there might be lawsuits.
Doesn't make sense to me.
Like, also, they might be freaked out by. I think probably the part of the issue is that all of this stuff at this point, like you said, it's just for experimental use. Like, it's not something where it was so settled and that they were so on board with that it was already out. It was something where this is an emergency. 5,000 people are dying a day. We got to do something. Okay, let's use the vaccine. And then you find, okay, wow, this is very effective. Good job. And then you say, okay, well, there's this weird anomalous symptom associated with it. All right, now what do you do? Is it indicative of something else? Is it something else we're not seeing? Is the numbers greater than what? Like, I don't know what's going on in their heads. I do know from the standpoint of them being doctors, in my experience, doctors have a tendency to be very towards the side of health, even to absurd degrees. And on some level, you heard that with Kogan, where it felt like he grudgingly agreed that when there were additional options, or if there are no other options, that maybe that's a bad idea. But grudgingly, like it's like he had to be dragged to it. But he's a doctor. I mean, you would expect him on some level to think that way. But roundly, I agree with you. With the exception of if there are other options. If there are other options, then no. Right? It's like what's the point in even taking 1% risk if you don't have to take the 1% risk?
But this again, it's not even one. It's like 0.001. That
right. It's not even
0.00001.
Right.
But here's the thing. Right. Again, it doesn't need to be keeping it in place for everybody. This is my particular prescription. I've heard a couple other people say this, but it's worrying to me that I'm not hearing it said more specifically by the medical authorities responsible for this. It's, as far as I know, between the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines, all of the limited cases that they've seen of cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, this rare blood clotting condition, in people who've gotten these vaccines, they have all been in younger women.
Yeah.
So if you could restrict it to younger men, and there's a particular logic that I went over that earlier, basically keeping the extremely high efficacy vaccines for the older folks and then younger men who are less likely to have serious conditions anyway. You give the Johnson & Johnson shot to them. They face basically no risk as far as the facts show so far statistically of having this serious blood clotting condition. They get this shot. And then you open up that many more shots for everybody else, including the young women who shouldn't be taking this. Even though with young women, the rate is so low, it would be justified if you didn't have other options. But that's the modified super safe position. And I think that we have the capacity, ideally, to do that kind of thing, to administer it that way. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm not sure why. It's a good point. I mean, if no men have been adversely affected by it, then it seems like man would be a safe bet for it. That's fair. The Senate has voted to pass a bill opposing hate crimes. Good for the Senate. Good for the Senate. They're against hate crimes. The bill would create a new position in the Justice Department to focus on the issue and aims to improve state and local hate crime reporting. The bill passed 94-1 with Senator Josh Hawley, the only senator to vote no. Look, sometimes I think people get put into positions where they're like, I refuse to be forced into this position. And so they look utterly ridiculous on the outskirts of that. Isn't there already laws against hate crimes? What am I missing? And doesn't the FBI and the Justice Department already go after hate crimes? I mean, what am I like?
Well, but it's right in the headline. It's right in the headline there. Two things, as far as I can tell. Two major components of this bill, and I'm sure there's other minutia. But one, it would create a special position in the DOJ for monitoring this stuff. So you basically put a point person in charge of the response in the chief federal judicial administration, the Department of Justice.
Right.
And at the same time, they're trying to improve reporting abilities basically in state and local governments. So whatever that one is a much larger umbrella. I don't know what the person they're planning on putting in charge of the DOJ would be doing, but it's passed the Senate. I'm sure Biden's signing it into law. It's going to be happening. We'll see what happens with it.
Does the Department of Justice not already have those powers?
But do they have a person in charge of it? And sometimes that can make a difference. Now, whether that's purely superficial, I don't know. That remains to be seen, and it probably is going to be determined by who they put in that position, what their role is, what their responsibilities are, that kind of thing. But yeah, I could see it helping,
Maybe. I don't know, man. I get so tired of what seems to be theatrical. And I get the feeling that if the Justice Department wanted to focus on it, the Justice Department could focus on it. Or if the White House wanted to put a point person on it, the White House could say, all right, we're going to make the czar of hate crimes. And the czar of hate crimes is going to go out and coordinate with the Justice Department for blah, 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 blah. Are you do you really need legislation for everything? And look, this is not me saying rah, rah hate crimes. It's not that. It's not that. I get tired of these guys doing what seems to be theatrical as opposed to actually getting real stuff done. And I wonder, is this another one of those cases? But okay, maybe I'm being too, much of a hard butt on this particular one. Those are your headlines.
Look at Jamarl. Here's the thing. Look at Congress. They managed to do something. Hooray! That's great.
No, they didn't. That's just the bill. That's the bill. But you're right. He's probably decided. I'd be shocked if the House of Representatives, guts it or something like that. It was like, yeah, we're not going to pass that as Democrats. Yeah, you're probably right. They're going to pass it. But yes. Applaud, they managed to do something. Oh, by the way, before I close the headlines out, congratulations, Virginia, next state for marijuana legalization, Northam.
Oh, yeah, coming later this year, yep.
Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And since we're having trouble getting a guest that we were planning on talking to, it would have been an interesting conversation. I'm going to take us somewhere else. Not only are we taking your calls during the segment, 202-521-1320, I also wanted to go into a conversation that Jamarl, you and I had sort of, not off the record, but just between ourselves yesterday, following on the conversation that I had and you had with Wilmer Leon yesterday on the show, and conversations that we've been having in previous days, and a sort of revelation that I had about messaging. Theater is one way to put it, or just nuanced phrasing and a sense of empathy when it comes to this stuff. I was thinking about, and you know what I'm talking about, Jamarl. When I started to push back, we had Wilmer Leon for a total of 3 segments, 2 sort of dedicated with him, and the last of which we were taking calls. And we were talking about the Derek Chauvin trial, and then we got into Black Lives Matter, the movement, and this whole conversation about police violence and police persecution, specifically of Black people, and racism in the police. I brought up, in your opinion, and I believe in Wilmer Leon's, almost certainly his opinion as well, dismissively, the idea, okay, but shouldn't we sort of refocus the conversation? Shouldn't we move on from this conversation or pivot? The more dismissive way to put it would be like, disregard the conversation about police violence in favor of looking at root causes. And I don't think I have literally ever used that word or anything like that, but I can get, looking back, how it came across that way as like dismissive. Instead of focusing on the 1,000 people who get killed while unarmed by the police every year, and just instead of focusing primarily on like the relationship between systemic racism in this country and how police treat specifically Black people, it would be good to focus on fundamental economic issues and where our leaders are choosing to focus their attention, specifically on foreign policy, specifically how our leaders seem to be captivated by 2 thought processes, either getting reelected, keeping their power within our power systems, or on maintaining America's position internationally, keeping other countries down effectively, keeping them from working with each other, as is the case with Russia and Europe with Nord Stream 2, keeping them from presenting some potential pact against the United States power. Basically, it seems like our leaders have split attention. Again, either getting reelected at home or maintaining America abroad. And if our leaders' attention are focused on that and not focused on making things fundamentally better for everybody in the United States, including and particularly Black people, then it seems like we're just going to see this problem play out again and again and again and again. And I realized, and you heard me realize it over the phone, or you heard me say it when we were talking about it, I could change my messaging very slightly. And maybe in some ways, just radically, change the way that it's presented on a deep level, which is instead of talking about this, we should be talking about this. I could say, in addition to talking about this, we should be talking about this. I'm speaking about it in kind of general terms. So basically, the argument that I have been making on the air, and maybe this is too nitpicky or something like that, or maybe this is too in the weeds and sausage makey for people, but instead of making the argument that it's unwise for us to focus so much of our time on this specific issue when we're failing to address the deeper root causes, I could say, in addition to focusing on this issue, we should bring those other things into the conversation. It would be great if the media added that stuff into the mix, like how our politicians, again, under Nixon, when J. Edgar Hoover called the Black Panthers the foremost national security threat in the United States, if instead of doing that, if he'd been focusing, and as he did that while he was fighting the Vietnam War and his attention was basically prioritized and dominated by this overseas engagement that we were in, if instead he'd been focusing on making living standards fundamentally better, on passing the sort of minimum wage or basic minimum income that he talked about at one point, if he'd put more attention into that, you might have seen fundamental, long-lasting changes in the American body politic. But whether we're talking about Nixon or Reagan or Clinton or either of the Bushes, et cetera, up through to the present moment, it seems like our leaders choose to prioritize foreign policy concerns and whatever hot button issue is likely to get them reelected. And I would still make that case strongly. But I guess, and so if I just pivoted it slightly, if I changed the messaging slightly, so it didn't seem like I was trying to exclude the conversation about police violence, which frankly I wasn't, just saying that it took up too much of the media's time. But if I instead had said, in addition to talking about that, we should talk about all this other stuff, I probably would have had more success with you, with Wilmer Leon, etc. I probably wouldn't have come across as dismissive, which you told me repeatedly it did. It came across as very plainly dismissive. Does that sound fair? Again, this is sausage making, but it's interesting to me partly because of where the conversation is at in society right now. And I guess in general,
I don't know if you would have had more sex
change
with
in terms.
Leon after that, but maybe. I'm sorry.
Maybe.
It was your words got more sex. No, I'm teasing. No, look, language. If my wife makes me dinner. Let's say she makes me dinner. This is a tangent, but I think it gets the point across. If she makes me dinner and she says, "Hey, how's this?" and I say, "It's not bad. It's not bad. It's pretty good." She knows that I don't like it. She knows I'm displeased with it. But that's a bit different than me saying, "This sucks." Those are two different things, right? Even though they both mean the same thing. The emphasis that's placed on one adds gravity. It adds something else to it that goes beyond just the technical things that the individual is saying. If you are going to bring in COVID, if you're going to bring in foreign policy, and the argument or the conversation is very specifically in a box of people being shot by cops, and we talk about things in boxes all the time. I mean, we just talked about the COVID thing, and nobody, came in and said, "Hey, what really matters is this military stuff. We're killing all these people a year. Screw the COVID." Like, nobody's doing that. But that seemed to be the way it came up over and over and over and over again. And so, yeah, I understand where you were coming from. It's just such a lot of wood to chop. And I don't know how that is, chopped in a way where it becomes abundant and clear that one is not being shirked for the other. But I think that's what you're trying to accomplish. Like, you're trying to cut that language in a way where it's extremely clear that this cop thing is a problem. This is something that is significant in our society. However, we also need to deal with the poverty and the deindustrialization in these areas that make this problem worse on some degree. It's some way that has to be cut it. Because I think, to me, where Wilmer Leon went is too strong in saying economics doesn't play a role. I don't buy that at all.
Said it's not related at all.
Yeah, and I don't buy that.
And that seems ridiculous.
Yeah, that seems too strong.
It seems like,
because if I don't see this happening in Beverly Hills, and even going with the argument that, well, a black person could get dragged out of a Jaguar anywhere, that is true. But is that more or less if the communities were on an even keel? Meaning, if I get rid of poverty in this country, does the number of shootings, does the amount of violence, does it go down or does it stay the same? I think the number goes down. What about police beatings or killings? Does that number go up or down? I think the number goes down. Even if that number just goes down by 30%, it makes the point that it goes down. And I think there will be additional side effects from that. Maybe you cut down on the amount of cops that you have because you don't have as many communities that are in disrepute. Maybe, I don't know. I guess my thought is there's an element of this that is entirely built into race. And you have to deal with this notion of, is it okay for cops to kill with impunity? Yay or nay? That has to be dealt with. Aside from anything else, you got to deal with that. Because I think our society has gotten too easy with the idea that a cop can fire. And the cop says, I was terrified. And that's in and of itself enough. And the question about, is there any other method, is there any other means for that cop to take that person alive? Yay or nay? And if that answer is no, fair enough. Like the person with the knife. If there's no way for that cop to get that woman out or that child out with that knife alive and save the other person, then fair enough. I get it. Clean shoot. But if there is, shouldn't the cop be held accountable? It's that. And then on the second question, I do think it's this question of, dude, why is that 13-year-old messing with that gun? I just think both dovetail. I think both.
You got to ask the second one. You need to be able to ask both sides of that question. I think.
Right.
No, and that's 100% right. And part of what I don't like about how the conversation is, we have to go to break soon. We have a call. I want to make sure we get to our caller before we go to break. So we might push this slightly longer. But you have to be able to ask both. Part of what's so frustrating about the conversation right now is that it is so polarized that if you take up one side, your side will hesitantly and rarely permit you to take up the other side simultaneously in the same conversation. You can't ask both sets of questions in the same breath without getting side-eye from people that you agree on most things with, who just see you rallying. It's become a tribal thing, as so many political things do pretty much by default. That is where the conversation has been left to die effectively.
Well, it's because it becomes, the goal of it is not to solve anything. Oftentimes, like when we're having these heavier arguments, the point of it is, I mean, you can understand where people come from. Like from one side, you have cops killing people, and for centuries, it gets a pass. It's not that big of a deal. The cop story is taken almost completely. And the side that says, no, they killed somebody and they didn't have to kill them. They beat this person. They didn't have to. That gets ignored. And so then you get a very hardened position of this person, despite that kid had a gun, despite that kid doing something that kid didn't have no business doing, or despite whatever, this cop was wrong. And the catch is the cop could have been wrong. That has to be acknowledged, right? But I think it's also, why is that kid living in that violent situation? I just think it's monstrous to leave it there, like with the cop. Because to me, it's like, but that kid is living in horrible situations. Why is that okay? Yeah.
Well, and here I want to go to this call, but two very quick points here. Both the media and the politicians, it seems undeniable to me, like the coordinators of public opinion and the people who are ostensibly supposed to represent and respond to it, seem like, by a variety of means, they don't want to actually solve the problem. They're focused merely on perpetuating the problem, and they're mired in these important but sort of higher order disputes without ever having a chance of addressing or solving the deeper ones. Right. And I hate that that's the status quo that we're in. We have a call though. Let's go to him. We have Tim calling from South Carolina. Tim, you're on. What's going on?
Okay, real quick. Globally, I think we should get out of other countries.
Tim, I'm going to cut. We cannot hear you, man. I think you might be driving or something, or it sounds like you're like living inside of a drawing machine.
Can you hear me now?
Can hear you absolutely now. What's going on?
Okay. Now, I was just going to say, so like globally, we should get out of other countries unless we're offering like actual humanitarian aid. I was also homeschooled, so I think it is crazy how. Now I just lost my thought.
It is crazy. I agree with you. I was also homeschooled though, Tim, and I agree with you. It is crazy. But here's the thing, Tim. Feel free to call back in at 9:45 a.m. Eastern. That's the closing segment for today's show. We've got our guest coming on this next segment. For the next two segments, we're going to be talking with Scott Ritter. So no calls then. But 100% agreed. It is crazy.
It's crazy.
You guys are
man.
listening to Fault Lines. Exactly, with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back with Scott Ritter on the other side of this short break. Be right back.
Fault lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Interesting report came out yesterday. Very interesting. And I love the way that the media doesn't necessarily ask questions when engaging this stuff, even though there's certain questions that spring to attention the moment that they write a story. Israel has targeted a number of positions in southern Syria after a missile landed in the direction of a secretive nuclear facility. First line, Newsweek article. Quote, a short while ago, surface-to-air missile fire was identified from Syria, which landed in a Negev area. The Israeli Defense Force said in a statement sent to Newsweek on Wednesday, Tuesday, Thursday time. Now, the interesting part to this is that they admit that the missile, right here, an Israeli official told Newsweek that the missile system involved was a stray Syrian SA-5, the name given to NATO Western Military Alliance to Russian-built S-200 surface-to-air missile system. Now, the official said there were no casualties or damage and that the missile was not aimed at Dimona, nor did it come close to hitting the nuclear site. Now, stop there for a moment. Israel has taken the position, along with the United States, that Iran, under no circumstances, become a nuclear nation. It is forbidden that we allow Iran to become a nuclear nation, so much so we are willing to destroy the world to prevent that reality from coming to play. The U.S. takes the JCPOA. Israel is entirely against the JCPOA, so much so that apparently Netanyahu or somebody is going to come here to give Biden the lowdown of it all on not engaging or getting back involved in the deal. But what's interesting here is that supposedly a stray Syrian missile, it wasn't aimed, quote unquote, it wasn't sent and fired in a ballistic fashion. It just so happened to mistakenly land near a nuclear facility. Now, the catch becomes, wait, nuclear? Nuclear? What do you mean nuclear? Yes, Israel has nuclear weapons. Now, they stay in this kind of obscurity or ambiguity, the sublime ambiguity associated with it. But everybody knows it. It's one of the most, the biggest secret in the world that nobody talks about. And yet they have them. And the fact that a Syrian missile landed near the facility and the news media needs to bring up the fact that Israel has a nuclear facility is phenomenal. Because I am unaware of this falling into U.S. media like this. At least not in my lifetime, or at the very least not in mainstream media in the way that it has this time around. To have a conversation about Israel's nuclear program and whether or not this was indeed a stray missile, or whether or not Syria has some level of ballistic missile capacity to actually take a shot at Israel. To bring us to have a conversation about this, we're joined with Scott Ritter. He's a former UN weapons inspector and weapons of mass destruction whistleblower. Scott, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. You are the first person we thought about when this issue came up, because it was understood that Israel had nuclear weapons. Fully understood, even though they wouldn't own up to it. It was just kind of this ambiguity. And now you have a situation where it seems a missile from Syria randomly, supposedly, lands near that facility, which leads to Israel attacking Syria for that missile landing in a stray fashion near their nuclear facility. This leads to several questions. One has to do with the nuclear facility itself. Israel has nuclear weapons. That's the first, I guess that's a question, I suppose, even though I think we know the answer to it. The second part to that, though, is how many nuclear weapons, how efficient are those nuclear weapons, and was this a stray missile or was this fired? What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, we know that Israel has nuclear weapons. The concept of ambiguity has been breached by Israel itself on several occasions where their leadership has outright acknowledged this, and then rapidly, I think the United States on one occasion actually chastised Israel, saying, we've expended a lot of diplomatic clout and an effort in helping you sustain deliberate ambiguity about your nuclear program, and now you're coming right out and saying that you're putting us in a tough position. Shut up. And so Israel's gone back to, we're not going to talk about it. But it's widely acknowledged that they have several hundred nuclear weapons. More interesting on this level of, nuclear weapons don't have an infinite life. They expire over time. They need to be maintained. In the United States, we have a situation where, we need to start manufacturing or remanufacturing plutonium pits that are used in nuclear weapons. We have almost every warhead on our Triton submarine nuclear deterrent is in danger of expiring and becoming useless. Perhaps not going off because they're getting too old. They need to be replaced. They need to be modernized. Israel has the same issue. And lately, there's been a lot of civilian satellite photographs that's showing, that Israel is upgrading its Dimona plant, the part of the plant that's associated with plutonium production. The implication of that is Israel is, either redesigning its warheads and needs new material, or it's modernizing, maintaining, upgrading. So Israel's in the process of doing X with a nuclear program that it doesn't officially acknowledge, but that's happening as we speak. And the reason why I bring that up is this is a very vulnerable time. Normally, these installations are hardened. They're covered with reinforced concrete, et cetera, to try and prevent any stray missile that might impact from doing any damage. But now you have a situation where there's excavation, sensitive materials being put in place. So a stray missile that lands near Dimona could do extreme damage. Fatal damage, which makes what happened all the more curious. Now we get to the issue of the missile. We've known for some time. I saw this in Iraq. The Iraqis did this, and every nation that has long-range surface-to-air missile capability knows this. You can convert a surface-to-air missile into a surface-to-surface missile. You don't have to do much except understand what a ballistic trajectory is, understand the fuel you have on when you get to burn out on the fuel, and then you point a radar spot in the sky, have the missile fly to that radar, achieve fuel burnout, and it goes on a ballistic missile trajectory to the ground. You disable the self-destruct mechanism. Normally, surface-to-air missiles have a self-destruct mechanism so that if they are tracking on a target and they miss the target, they just don't are flying around hitting anything. They self-destruct. So, first of all, the fact that this missile landed in Israel means that its self-destruct mechanism either malfunctioned or was deliberately disabled. And the other thing is, even though the Israelis are calling it an accident, from an intelligence standpoint, it would be interesting to know what the Syrian radar was doing. Did the Syrians put a radar dot in the sky and have the missile guide on that? We don't know. The fact that the Israelis chose to strike in a concerted effort, even though calling it an accident, implies that it wasn't an accident, that this might have been a deliberate mistake, quote unquote, by the Syrians. Because if it was an accident, then this is an overreaction on the part of Israel. It just seems to me that there might be more to the story, and some information would need to be released by Israel or Syria, neither of whom are likely to release information about what was really going on. Again, is it possible that the Syrians fired an SA-5 surface-to-air missile whose self-destruct mechanism malfunctioned and it went on a purely serendipitous trajectory that brought it within the vicinity of Dimona? Yes. Is it likely that that's what happened? No. So I believe that this might have been a message from the Syrians to the Israelis that it's not just a one-way street, that if you keep bombing us, accidents like this may continue to happen.
Well, and there's a weird inversion. I mean, we thought of you to talk about with this, not just because of your experience as a WMD whistleblower, but also, of course, because of your ongoing foreign policy coverage and your experience there. But there's a weird inversion when you compare it back to the situation in Iraq back in 2001, 2002, where there was an outright lie at the time that a country that, claiming that a country had weapons of mass destruction, when it seems that it was widely known by the key parties that it didn't. With Israel, there's an outright denial that a country has weapons of mass destruction when it seems widely known that it, in fact, does. There's a weird inverted phenomenon happening here. And so when we saw that, I don't think we mentioned this in the headlines yesterday, but I believe at no point in yesterday's show did we fixate our attention on the weird hypocrisy and the weird out in the openness of this, where there's a recognition widespread that Israel has a nuclear facility, and it's not reported in any of the articles that I saw what that facility does, but it doesn't seem like a nuclear energy facility. It seems like, again, something that you would use with either plutonium, like you mentioned, or uranium, basically enrichment for producing fissile materials that you would then use in a nuclear warhead. There's a weird again, like a weird publicity of this without officially recognizing it. At the same time as they call it I've seen it called a secretive facility or a top secret facility. Why are they mentioning it? Why is that even coming up? I mean, on both of those counts, Scott, from the media's coverage of this to what's actually happening there, how do you see this? What's going on here?
Well, the media has been complicit in helping sustain the Israeli policy of ambiguity by deliberately underreporting Dimona. Look, we know what kind of reactor it is. It was given birth as a French reactor that is specifically for the production of nuclear material usable in a nuclear weapon. We know this. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. This is not a power generating civilian nuclear reactor. This is a nuclear reactor, a nuclear facility that exists for the sole purpose of producing fissile material, plutonium, and uranium for nuclear weapons use. We know this. And so by mentioning a nuclear research facility at Dimona, even though the only research it does is in relationship to nuclear weapons, the media is complicit in playing this game. And then the U.S. government continues to play this game by, again, not acknowledging straight up what the reality is. I think a lot of people forget that when the Israelis were building this facility back in the 60s, John F. Kennedy and then later Lyndon Johnson were pushing for inspections. They wanted U.S. inspectors to go in there and verify what Israel was doing, and Israel refused to allow this to happen. We know exactly what's going on in Dimona. I'll give you another example of how we know. Do you remember the Stuxnet virus that went in, the Israelis and the Americans worked on to destroy centrifuges in Natanz? In the lead up to this, we took Libyan centrifuges, which were the same model as being used by the Iranians, and we gave them to Israel, and Israel built a centrifuge cascade to replicate what the Iranians had at Dimona, and then they tested the Stuxnet virus on that. So, we know that we know what the purpose of the Dimona reactors. We work with the Israelis on sensitive nuclear proliferation issues that are exclusively associated with weaponization. So, it's a game that's being played, and it's a dangerous and disingenuous game, especially when we're holding the Iranians to this what they call the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty 2 standard, meaning you have the NPT standard that's recognized by international law and the agreement, Article 4 of which allows nations who are signatories in good standing to have the totality of a nuclear fuel production cycle, inclusive of enrichment. That's Iran. Iran fits that category. But what we've done is created a second standard for Iran. More inspections, greater restrictions, etc. At the same time, one of the nations that's pushing for this is Israel, which won't allow inspectors, which has a nuclear weapons program that's undeclared, unmonitored, and in doing so creates an incentive for other nations to seek these weapons. I mean, people need to understand that Israel's nuclear capability is not a deterrent. It's actually it's an irritant that produces antibodies, and those antibodies are other nations seeking to acquire a similar capability to deter Israel's nuclear weapons. So Israel is perhaps the most destabilizing presence for a number of reasons, but among which is its nuclear program in the Middle East and indeed the world today.
Well, and if there weren't the issue with the Palestinians, if there weren't the continued apartheid in Palestinian territories, and if there weren't the constant sabotage attempts, assassinations, violent acts effectively by Israel against other countries, I don't think that most people would care about it. And now some of these, specifically with the Palestinians, that is pivotal to the existence of that nation. So I don't know how you get around that. But my point is, generally, it's not, as far as I can tell, that there's that much else that's special about Israel that, would draw the ire or would give us reason to dislike what it does so often. But we need to go into a break. We're going to be coming back with Scott Ritter, continuing this conversation. I want to get into what the hell is going through people's minds. It seems like the Biden administration specifically is more bellicose than ever with the soulless killer messaging. Made first the soulless claim by Biden to Putin directly back in 2011 from what Biden said, now reiterated just a couple of weeks ago in an interview with George Stephanopoulos. us making claims that are harsher than we ever saw during the Cold War. And when you add to that the idea that we have still quite a few nuclear weapons and more being produced in a lot of these countries like we're talking about all around the world, I want to get into this topic of have we lost the ball or is there something deeper going on here? In any event, we're going to be coming back on that conversation with Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and WMD whistleblower. You can follow him on Twitter at @RealScottRitter. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I want to get into a conversation of whether or not we have lost the plot. Now, I don't want to make these lines, I don't want to draw these lines too sharply, but just to to try to set up briefly the history as I see it. During the Cold War, there was a pitted ideological dispute between capitalism and communism, with the United States, of course, and the Soviet Union taking up each of their sides on this bargain. Now, this was an interesting, ideologically, it's interesting because there was a good deal of support for communism in the United States. I would argue more support here, at least vocally expressed, than there was for capitalism in Russia at the time. And with that fact in mind, it seemed like it was harder, for other reasons too, but it seemed like it was harder for the presidents of the United States at any given point during that period to vilify too harshly and personally the leader of this opposing country. Now, we did plenty of vilification. I'm not trying to say that didn't happen, but it doesn't seem to match with what we see now, where, again, Biden back in 2011 in a personal meeting with Putin reportedly called him a soulless person, saying to his face, "You have no soul." First claimed a couple of years after that event, now reiterated by Biden in an interview with George Stephanopoulos, also saying that, yes, he believes that Putin is a killer. Again, that seems much, much sharper and much more poisonous language than was said at any point during the Cold War. And part of what might be at play here is that instead of this being an ideological dispute between capitalism and communism, it has now become, at least in the words of the West, a different kind of dispute between democracy and authoritarianism, whether you're talking about China or Russia or a variety of other countries. Venezuela, other countries come to mind, of course, too. And it is far harder for people in the United States to openly say that they're authoritarians. There are relatively few people, I can't think of many, and they're all on the fringes of society, who are like, yeah, go authoritarianism. In other words, it's much easier to vilify somebody that you can paint that way because there aren't people who are sympathetic with their side. Now, this is coming. This much more biting language is coming as the world is still, as far as I can tell, situated on the brink of a nuclear catastrophe. Now, Scott, here's where I want to come to you. We were joined by Scott Ritter, by the way. He is a former UN weapons inspector and WMD whistleblower. You can follow him on Twitter at @RealScottRitter. Scott, is it just that we've lost the plot? Is it just that the language and the rhetoric and the minds of the people who are saying these words are so far away from the grim reality of what could happen if things were to escalate? Or is it, and there's a possibility of this too, that we have some deterrent system, some, anti-nuclear system that emboldens us and gives us the confidence and the security, the perception of it at least, to say these things without seriously worrying about the fallout? Or is it something else? I want to go to you, Scott. What's your take? Why are we willing to do these things? Why is Biden willing to say these things about Putin?
Well, Biden's in a difficult position. The period of time between when he stopped being vice president and when he became president was marked by 4 years of this guy named Donald Trump. And Donald Trump accelerated the process of deterioration of the single polar world dominated by the United States that had driven global geopolitics since the end of the Second World War. We saw since 9/11 that the United States was no longer ascendant. The United States had plateaued off, and then through George W. Bush's reign and into Obama, we started to slide downwards, even while not acknowledging it. organizations like NATO were drawn into question. Is this an alliance that we still need? The rules-based international order that we hear so much about was being called in question by the world, who said, do we really want the United States to have this kind of hegemony, this kind of dominance over everything, or should we break up global power into different poles around the world reflective of global reality? Trump accelerated this, and one of the things about Biden is that his presidency has been supported by the quote-unquote establishment. Now, the establishment is that power structure which came into dominance because of the rules-based international order, because of the concept of a single polar globe revolving around the United States. So Biden's, all of his rhetoric has been about, reclaiming this role. If you read, the documents put out by the White House, put out by the National Intelligence Council lately, they have a global threat assessment, and they say, democracy is in the ascendance, that the future of the world now is tied to the success of democracy, and the United States is at the forefront of bringing democracy back as the global standard. Now, that's wishful thinking. It runs counter to every narrative, every trend that exists in the world today. But it's purely a rhetorical notion. But that's what Biden's left with. He's left with words. Biden, he got caught up in his own trap. First of all, let's talk about a couple of things. One, the concept of peering into Putin's eyes and seeing his soul was not invented by Joe Biden. It comes from actually George W. Bush, who, when he met with Putin back in, I think, 2001, 2002, in that time frame, famously said, I looked into his eyes and I saw his soul. I saw that he had a soul. And Bush had been, that came under attack over and over again. So Biden claims that in 2014, when he was on a diplomatic mission, the sole purpose of which was to put forward a reset with Russia, at a time when he was giving speeches in Russia, saying that the Russians were among the most dominant and successful scientists in the world, and that's why the United States had to pay attention to Russia, because it was a global power. He claims he had a one-on-one meeting with Putin in the Kremlin where he made this insult to Putin. I looked into your eyes and you have no soul. Guess what, Biden? There's a transcript of this meeting. It never happened. He never said that. But he then has gone on and made up this history about him and Putin's interaction, and it's become part of the folklore of Biden. And so, so he's been repeating it that, I told Putin he's soulless. He has no soul. He never told Putin that at all. He's just spouting it off. Then you combine that with, a set-up question delivered by Stephanopoulos. Anybody who says that Biden, this was a misspoken or he didn't think about it, no, this was a deliberate softball question for the exact purpose, because Donald Trump was asked, or by Bill O'Reilly, he said, Putin's a killer. And Donald Trump said, there's lots of killers. We're all killers. You think he's the only one in the world that we do bad things too? One of the most honest statements a president's ever made. He was reviled for it. You're not allowed to speak about that. And so to contrast between him and Donald Trump, Stephanopoulos asked the question, do you think Putin is a killer? And, Biden, of course, gave us his steely-eyed look. Yes, he's a killer. So now we've caught this myth of the soulless killer. It's insanity. National leaders don't behave like this.
No, they don't. Right there. They don't.
No, they don't.
And that's the shocking part to this. I've never, even during the Cold War, it seems like there was more respect among foreign leaders than now. I mean, it seems like it goes almost as a norm where you can xenophobic get away with it, whether that's against the Chinese, whether that's against the Russians, whether that's against the Iranians. We even went so far as to say the Iranian military were terrorists. Think about that. And what that means in the context of a geopolitical context where we're expecting a certain degree of respect for either our own world leaders or our own military, while simultaneously not allowing the same respect elsewhere. It is a very bizarre mentality that we've appropriated in the country. And it's not just the world leaders, it's also the media. I mean, like you said, Stephanopoulos asked him that question. And if you ever look at Jen Psaki or the other one, Blinken, like their point of view of the world, I have a hard time seeing how they're any different than Mike Pompeo. Am I insane on this? I mean, Blinken and Pompeo seem like they're the exact same person in regards to the way they act and engage the world. Tell me this. It seems like the world is breaking or bifurcating into two world spheres. And it is not like the Soviet Union where there were certain fracture points and weaknesses that were built into that made it difficult to kind of propagate itself. It doesn't seem like that. It seems like you have China, Russia, Iran, Syria, North Korea. You may even get Turkey within an X number of years, depending upon sanctions and how the West engages them. It really, honest to God, does seem like we've broken into two world spheres. What are your thoughts? Oh, we have to close it here. I apologize. We have to close it here. Look, the voice that you guys are listening to, Skywriter. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Back in a moment.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is now time for the last hour this morning and this week of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, events, and more across our disunited states of America and the increasingly divided, embattled, fraught surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Alrighty, folks. I hope everybody's morning continues to go well, whether you're just joining us or you've been with us for the full show, the first 2 hours this morning. Hope your morning is going very well. I want to give people a quick overview of today's show so far. At 7:30, we spoke with Peter Oliver about the planned soccer league and the greed endemic to that planned soccer league, as well as Nord Stream 2 and Ukraine, how the German press is treating the issue with Ukraine. Just interesting conversation. That started about 7:30 this morning. Go back and check it out. At 8:30, from 8:30 to 9, we just finished up a conversation with Scott Ritter. We were talking about the reportedly accidental, but I don't buy it, missile strike near an Iranian base launched by Syria. And I say accidental because it was a surface-to-air missile. Usually those go off, in the air. But as Scott was saying, it seems pretty unlikely that that's what happened. It seems more likely that this was a shot across the bow to Israel, effectively warning them that Syria knows, potentially warning them that Syria knows where this facility is and that they're, potentially striking it, that kind of thing. Anyway, we closed that conversation talking about what the heck Biden is thinking with the, increasingly flamey rhetoric against Putin, which, again, I can't think of at any point during the Cold War and the period since then up to Biden, how, any language approaching what Biden said to Putin when he called him, saying to his face, apparently, you have no soul, and calling him a killer in an interview recently. And the interesting thing that Scott brought up that was just outside of my political consciousness, I remember it now that he brought it up, but it wasn't center of mind for me, is that, when Bush made those comments saying that he looked into Putin's eyes and that he had no soul, Biden was clearly, when he made those comments, I believe he first made them back in 2011, and it was first reported that he had made them back in 2014, if he made them at all, which I frankly kind of doubt. But hey, if he made them at all, it seems like he was trying to rebut George W. Bush's take. It seems like he was trying to, firmly put his stance in the ground, put his flag in the ground. And what's interesting to me is that wasn't that right at the same time that Obama was continuing to try to ease up relations with Russia, trying to make relations better with Putin?
Yeah,
this is exactly before the Ramadan.
The reset, if you remember.
Exactly. No, exactly. That's the thing. So was Biden acting against Obama's interest in that way? Because if on the one hand, the president of the United States is trying to reconcile our country with another country, and then on the other hand, his vice president, the second in command, the person immediately under him, who's ostensibly acting under his authority, representing the U.S., if he goes to this other country and tells that person that he has no soul, what the hell?
Well, apparently he did this right after he led the march to liberate the movie theaters in Georgia. When they were segregated in the thing. Joe Biden is a habitual liar. I mean, come on. Like, this is the same guy who said he was liberating movie theaters. And he comes out later and says, okay, I never did that. Or the guy who, did amazingly in school and found out, no, he was at the end of his school thing. He lies. He wasn't with Mandela. He didn't get locked up in South Africa. And no, he probably didn't tell Putin no nonsense like that.
No, I kind of doubt that it actually happened, because if he had done that, he would have been going directly against what his president wanted, unless Obama was lying, unless he was actually trying to make relations worse. But that kind of doesn't fly. That was one of his main foreign policy things at the time. And the fact, as far as I can tell, please, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, shanestranahan@gmail.com. You can also call into the show to correct me, 202-521-1320. The reporting of the comments that Biden said he made back in 2011, I believe it was, that first came out in 2014, which is when the Euromaidan was in full swing. If I were to go back and check the article, I bet it would be either while that was in action or immediately after it, with the Poroshenko government's installation, that whole process. In other words, he retrospectively rewrote history to try to paint himself as an adversary of Putin,
yes, exactly.
Try to vilify Putin, and to try to slam into the ground that the United States is not gonna play nice effectively. Anyway. That was our conversation with Scott Ritter from 8:30 to 9. We just wrapped that up. Later on this hour, we plan, hopefully successfully, to speak with Kim Iverson. We're going to be talking about the Derek Chauvin trial, YouTube, where, I mean, you saw this. You were the one who was bringing this up, Jamarl. Interesting article where the CEO of YouTube basically saying that YouTube is not for you anymore.
Pretty much.
For some reason, repeatedly targeting people in their basements publishing to YouTube. Again, just trying to denigrate members of the public, and instead saying that they're going to prioritize more authoritative sources. Very interesting conversation to have, and we'll be coming back to that again with Kim Iverson later on this hour. But without further ado, let's get into the headlines this morning. First up, in COVID news, here in the United States, at least 66,362 new COVID cases were reported yesterday, with 911 new deaths. Over the past week, there has been an average of 62,956 cases per day. There's a decrease from the average 2 weeks earlier. 27% of the American public has been fully vaccinated, and 41% of residents have received at least one dose. And as of this morning, more than 31,951,438 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and about 569,875 have died from it. A day after breaking the previous record for the most new cases in a single day, India has done so again, with more than 332,000 cases of COVID reported today from the country, and with deaths also jumping to a record high for the country of 2,263 deaths in a single day. Many hospitals in the most saturated regions of India have reached full capacity and are now running low on or are out of oxygen and other supplies needed to treat patients with COVID. And as we were talking about in the headlines yesterday, this comes as hospitals have reportedly been looted, and there's racketeering going on, with supplies either stolen from the hospitals or bought from them in shady deals being sold at dramatically upmarked prices is what would be going on here, with racketeering after all. And again, the hospitals, a lot of them reached capacity. They're not taking in new patients with COVID. There are lines of people outside waiting. And if you remember, the whole point with, remember the phrase flattening the curve, which has fallen out of vogue for like a year at this point. It's been a long time, maybe not quite, but maybe 9-10 months or something like that since we've heard that talk. The whole point with flattening the curve was that you lower the number of people, you slow it down. That was the original push for having lockdowns, is that you slow down the number of people who are getting sick. Because if you don't, what you're going to have is hospitals being overrun. And once the hospital is overrun, once people in a city or in a community, in a town, whatever, if they get sick and the hospital is full, the mortality rate jumps from 1 or 2 or 3% much higher. If people can't get treatment and there's, they just are forced to live through the disease, live out the course of the disease, they're much more likely to die. And we were thankfully in the United States mostly able to stave that process off. You saw in New York, in Los Angeles, in a couple of the big metropolitan centers, the hospitals nearing, and in some cases it seemed reaching capacity with the IC units in those hospitals effectively getting close to full, or in some cases getting full. But it seemed to pretty much stop there. It didn't seem like there were long lines after the fact. It was just that we were kind of rising up to meet that edge. In India, it seems like they have passed that. And what I'm worried about is the spread is going to continue. The cases are going to keep going up. And therefore, the number of people who get this disease in its worst in its worst way and aren't treated for it is going to go up. And we're going to see the highest mortality rate in India compared to any other country on the face of this earth. And with such a large population, that could be the worst hit country in the world. But I'm just saying that could happen. I'm not a prognosticator. I don't know what exactly is going to happen. I don't have a magic 8-ball that can tell me this stuff, but it seems that causally that seems like it very well could happen. So please do pay attention to this. We'll be covering this for sure. Back in the United States, another woman, this time in Oregon, reportedly had low platelets and a rare blood clot condition as a result of receiving the Johnson & Johnson shot. She has died after receiving that shot. And again, after developing this rare condition, cerebral venous sinus thrombosis. The use of that shot, the J&J shot, was paused earlier this month on the concern that it, along with the AstraZeneca vaccine, could be causing cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, this rare blood clotting condition. Again, when we spoke with Dr. Mikhail Kogan a couple weeks ago at this point, he told us he had to look it up, basically. He wasn't familiar with what it was, with what was causing it. With this condition. So he had to pull out his medical textbooks, go back over it. It's not that well known of a condition, which means that the fact that even small numbers of people are getting it, if it's significantly higher than the base rate for this condition in the public, that's worrying. And again, it seems to have to do with the AstraZeneca and the J&J shots, both of which are based on the older delivery technique for vaccination, based on the adenovirus delivery technique. Anyway, in national political news, the Senate has voted to pass a bill opposing hate crimes. The bill will create a new position in the Justice Department to focus on the issue, and it aims to improve state and local hate crime reporting. The bill was passed 94-1, with Senator Josh Hawley the only senator to vote no. A new panel is recommending that the United States military should change the way it handles sexual assault cases. The independent panel, created by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, is recommending that sexual assault cases not be heard from within the chain of command, with commanders now reviewing and sometimes blocking sexual assault claims. Again, this panel would aim to change that. Austin will now review these recommendations and consult with leaders in the military, who, again, up to this point, haven't wanted an outside chain of command, some outside authority to come in and intervene in their affairs, even if people are getting raped or assaulted or even harassed. It's ridiculous. This stuff should be handled from outside. And of course, as Jamarl kind of jokingly put it earlier, what are you trying to do, Shane? Interfere with our military, slow this stuff down? One more quick headline here, too, on the national side of things. Governor Ralph Northam of Virginia, like you brought up, Jamarl, has signed into law a bill that would legalize marijuana in the state of Virginia. And I believe that would come into full effect on July 1st, not too long now, just a few short months away. So for Virginia residents, I'm sure, if you live in Virginia, we broadcast in D.C., we broadcast in Kansas City. I know we have folks who live in Virginia who are listening to this. In a couple of months, if you want to, you could light up. It would
legally.
Be legal for you now.
Legally.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Thank you. And here's the thing, Jamarl, you're a Richmond, Virginia native, right?
Exactly. Born and raised.
So how does this, you're a Virginian. How do you feel about this?
I feel it's good. It's funny. They opened up centers already. There were places in Virginia where you could have already gone and bought, even in Richmond, apparently. So I don't know what the provision was that they put into advance. Maybe they had that kind of weird ambiguity like they did in D.C., where it's like you can own, but you can't purchase. So what that means in real practice, or in practice, is if I go to a pop-up and there's a guy who's standing there selling and has a huge amount of marijuana. Now, I can't buy. That's illegal. That's against the law. What I can do, though, is he can give me as much as I want. Let's say he gives me an ounce. And he says, would you like a lollipop? Now, I can buy the lollipop. I can even give him a donation. I just can't purchase. So you end up in this kind of weird ambiguity of, you're not buying this. You're buying the lollipop. Just know it. You're buying the lollipop.
I think it was medical. I think no, and that's the weird situation in DC. I know that. Good. Here's a free lollipop. Those little toys that you can get for 25 cents from those machines where it pops it out in a little eggshell plastic cup or whatever, and then inside you have it. It's like, well, yeah, that's a $40 toy, and here's an 8 on the side. That toy. It's a weird condition. In Virginia, I think it's medical marijuana that was what you were seeing there.
Yeah.
Because that is legal.
Yeah.
It seems like it's fairly restrictive. Or again, growing up in LA, where for a time before
let's be honest,
it was fully legal.
The medical thing is a fig leaf. It's a fig leaf.
Well,
It's
in some states.
I have a bad knee. Okay, well, here's some pot. You can get 4 ounces. Oh, doc, my back. Or it's like, doc, I'm nervous. I'm just nervous, doc. All right, well, here's a bag of weed. And here is like any medical condition.
Doctor, I have anxiety.
Right.
Doctor, I'm an anxious person.
Right.
I'm socially anxious. I sweat at night, and I really need a 200 milligram edible to calm me down every couple hours. No, I'm just kidding. But,
if it's not for that, doc, I can't function. Yeah, it's that.
Exactly. Okay, here's the thing. We have our guest on the line, but I want to get at least one more quick headline in here, maybe two. In international news, Russia's defense ministry announced that starting May 1st, they would begin to withdraw troops from near the Ukrainian border following the completion of military exercises in the region. This comes just a day after Russian President Vladimir Putin announced in his annual State of the Nation address that Russia will respond if other countries cross a red line, quote unquote. And this also, of course, comes as the media in the West, including in Germany, as we heard this morning, is widely negligent in reporting what actually happened here, where in Ukraine there was increased artillery shelling. The Ukrainian government moved its military eastward to the points of contact in the Luhansk and in the Donbass, on the borders of the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics near Crimea, and Russia reciprocated. We leave out the first part. We only focus on how they moved their troops, and then we paint it as them being aggressive. Anyway, that's that. And I think that's the last truly significant headline here. So I'm gonna go to a break. We're gonna come back with Kim Iverson talking about the Chauvin trial, but getting into a potentially fiery conversation. But we'll see. It's great to have Kim back on the show. It's been a little while. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you guys want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So Derek Chauvin is convicted, and convicted on all counts, very clearly convicted. Derek Chauvin, in that trial, you had multiple police officers come out in order to basically put a knife in Chauvin, saying this is not policing. This is not what we're accustomed to. This is not what we do. In fact, the prosecution went so far as to say this is not a prosecution of policing. This is a protection of policing, basically a rejuvenation of what it means to be a cop, and that what Chauvin did was beyond the pale. Personally, I think policing should be on trial. And I think that notion that you have 1,000 cops, or 1,000 people killed a year, with 1% of those people prosecuted, I think is appalling. This has nothing to do at this point, meaning that 1,000 number, with race. That's just bad in and of itself that you have that many take place, for whatever reason you have that many taking place. But I do think you have to start on some level with accountability. Chauvin, however, is not indicative of a change in our system. If 99% walk, that means that 1% get prosecuted. Chauvin is just indicative of the 1%. This is not indicative of something that has transpired. And until we see something that there's far more accountability built into the process, I am not willing to say that this case meant anything. To have a conversation about this, and I maybe agree, maybe disagree, we're going to see. I'm not quite sure where she falls on this. But Kim Iverson, independent journalist, host of the Kim Iverson Show on YouTube, one of my favorite guests. We always get into these good conversations. Kim, before we start, though, I do want to ask about your dad. It was brought to our attention that your dad was ill. I think Shane told me about it. How is he doing?
Thank you so much for asking. My dad's a big fan of yours, so he'll be thrilled to know that you've asked. He's doing much better. On April 1st, he collapsed. I thought it was a joke. Of course, it's like the worst day in the entire year to collapse and to have somebody say, "Oh, I'm being," my brother saying, "Oh, Dad's being rushed to the hospital. He was collapsed." He collapsed, and my sister and I thought it was an April Fool's joke, but it wasn't a joke. Unfortunately, Dad collapsed and ended up in the hospital for a week. Luckily, survived. And now he's a bionic man. He has a pacemaker. So he's actually feeling really good. I mean, he was really reluctant to get a pacemaker. I think a lot of people are when they have a heart event and they're like, "Oh no, I have to get this thing." And but really glad he did, because now he's feeling like he's got a new spring in his step, apparently.
Wow.
So
My
he's doing
grandmother.
really well.
When she got her pacemaker, I think it was something similar. She was having depreciated heart function, but she had depreciated heart function from stuff that happened to her when she was a kid, like some kind of virus or something that damaged her heart. But yeah, she had a pacemaker for years, decades, where they would have to go in every so often, retool it or fix it, that type of stuff. But yeah, it made her feel better, than what she was when she first got it. So I'm so glad he's doing better. That's good. And it's kind of a reverse April Fool's joke. It's like, Dad's joking. And then it's like, no, Dad's not joking, which is kind of this kind of weird reverse on the April Fool's thing. But no, I'm glad he's doing better. That's good. So, the Chauvin trial. Now, we've had our back and forth on this. This has been another one of those cases where we've had, we've talked about it in different ways. So, from your standpoint, how do you frame this? And maybe I should ask the question this way. Do you think that this trial is indicative of anything? I've been a Scrooge McDuck on this. I've been like, stop celebrating. There's nothing to celebrate. Nothing has fundamentally changed. Of course, a case like this that was so over the top was going to get prosecuted. But I think the concern, and I think it's indicative of how we see policing in this country, that even something like that seemed to be indefensible, even by police themselves. And keep in mind, cops defended killing Tamir Rice, 12-year-old. And so they still wouldn't defend Chauvin on this. So is this indicative of something that has changed in perspective? Or am I being too hard on this saying, yeah, I don't see anything change on this. Of course, 1% is going to get prosecuted. He's 1%. Or no, something has fundamentally changed in our society in the way we look at this stuff. How do you frame this?
Well, I guess I'm not as much of a Scrooge McDuck on this one as you are. I actually do think things have fundamentally changed. I do think more cops will be held accountable. I do think that we're going to see more trials of cops and quite frankly, I think all of them should be. I mean, if there's ever a cop homicide, which there's about 900 to 1,000 per year, regardless of the circumstances, I think every cop in that situation needs to go to a trial rather than some sort of ombudsman sort of in-house review board. It needs, where they're all buddy and chummy with one another. I think we as the public, when a cop that we pay, they're on our payroll essentially, and they're here to protect and serve the public. If they do commit homicide, whether justified or not, I do think that they should go to trial. Now, that's probably not going to happen. Most of them still won't. Many of them are very justified, and we see that in footage that many of them are justified. But nonetheless, I think that if they are justified in a courtroom, that would be obvious and it would be a quick case. Whereas in other times, it's, would require more deliberation, and other times it's also pretty quick. Like I think in Chauvin's case, it was pretty quick, right? With the jury came back pretty much right away and said guilty. So
10 hours of deliberation. That's less. It's a day later. 10 hours of deliberation, and yeah, of course, usually when they're that quick, it's going to be a guilty verdict. Usually, they don't have to think about it too much by definition.
Yeah, so I actually think more cops are going to be seeing trial. So I do think things have fundamentally changed in that way. I guess it just depends on what it is you're wanting the change to be, and that's where I think there needs to be a really big conversation about this. There was actually a study that just came out. This guy, he's a economist at University of Massachusetts Amherst, Travis Campbell, and he just came out with a research paper a month ago or 2 months ago, and he's very pro BLM. Now, in his research paper, he went and studied. Now, this is before the protests of 2020, before the George Floyd protests. He went and studied 5 years of BLM protests. There was 1,654, I think, is what he examined. And of those what he discovered was in all of these cities that had these protests, they did see a reduction in police homicides over that course of 5 years in the areas where there were these mass protests, right? They saw 300, they calculated out that 300 lives actually were saved from these protests. But they also saw an increase in homicides to the tune of upward of 6,000 people murdered in those 5 years. And they're not sure why, but because they didn't do that much studying on that, but what they kind of theorize is that when we as a society demonize the police and we say defund them or get rid of them or we don't want them around, they don't come around. And then that
is insane. And I'm not seriously pushing back on the idea of it. I'm looking into this now. I want to read through the paper, but the idea that, okay, you saved 300 lives at the hands of police, but homicides rise to the tune 20 times that, 20 times more people dying. If it's simple math, 300 is 1/20th of 6,000. That's crazy. Where would you go with that?
Yeah, well, most of those 6,000 are Black lives. So, I think there needs to be a big discussion on this. We know that about 55% at least of those 6,000 are Black folks. So how do Black lives matter? I mean, I think we have to be very careful about, I think that research study, and other researchers have looked at that study and said, yes, their data corroborates that it's all in line with previous studies. And that is before the 2020 George Floyd protests. And what we know is that last year we saw a massive uptick in murder in 2020. So
I was talking about that. Yeah, rates we haven't
problem
seen
is
in 20
last
years.
year's the COVID stuff. I mean, it needs to be. That is like the worst time frame to try to give any kind of assessment. It's like so out of the whack in regards to what took place.
Right.
Like last year basically fell off a cliff.
Right. Well, that's why the research paper does not include last year.
Okay.
If you did include last year, then the numbers are going to look even more stark. And of course, you have to take into other consideration, even though the murder uptick was like 38% or something. Obviously there were a lot of factors that contributed to that.
Right.
But it still has to be this big conversation. I think that what it really boils down to in my mind is clearly we need to hold police accountable. There has to be change within the police departments, the way they're trained, the policing. We can't have panicking cops shooting panicking people, which is really ultimately what happens a lot of the time.
Well, and then get a pass for it. Because to me, I don't think I'm unfair to cops. And clearly, I don't think anybody thinks they're being unfair, right? So whatever value that is. But I think I do try to look at cops as human beings and think to myself, if I'm in that situation, how would I respond? That's the only way, I can process it. And it's like let's take the last one, Mickey O'Brien. Perfect example. A cop gets to the scene. A cop is radio. Somebody calls the cop saying, hey, there's something going on. There's some disturbance. Somebody's concerned. Somebody's life is at threat or somebody's in danger. Cop gets to the scene. The cop runs to the scene. The cop sees somebody about to stab somebody else. The cop pulls out his gun, shoots. Cops thinks he's protecting. Coming to find out that the person with the gun was actually the person that called and had just, I suppose, got the advantage or whatever, was holding people back, but ends up killing her. Now, the question immediately that I ask is there any way for that cop, legitimately, not in some kind of, Wolverine type way where he has these superhuman reflexes. No, in a human being way, to come away keeping her alive and keeping the other person alive. Is there a legitimate way to do it? And if the answer is yes, then maybe the cop should be prosecuted. If the answer is no, then I get how monstrous it is, but how do you hit the cop? Like, it's not, I don't think all of these situations are straightforward. And I think part of the problem is cops have done so much horrible things and have gotten away with it for so long that it's zero tolerance. So even for a case like this, where the cop should get the benefit of the doubt, a large number of people don't. My mom, I was talking to her about this, and she was like, that cop should be prosecuted. And I said, well, what was the cop to do in that situation? Even though she couldn't answer me, she couldn't answer. Like, she couldn't say, well, she should have did this. Yeah, but what if that didn't work? Meaning, like, do you know that a taser would have worked? And if that was your kid and your kid gets stabbed, would you be okay with a cop trying to find a less lethal way if the less lethal way ends up getting your kid killed? Well, she doesn't want to answer that. That's a horrible question to answer. You know what I mean? Like, this stuff immediately comes into play for this very specific case. And the nuance of it got dropped into cops just killed a 60-year-old again. Now, again, some of this stuff the cops have built up over decades and decades and decades of horrible, horrible behavior that they've gotten away with. And so it's the zero tolerance stuff. By the same token, my job is not to do that. My job is to kind of look at it and actually get into the nuance and the ambiguities of it to try to get some level of truth. Like, does that make sense? It's like, let's do this. Let's take a break, and we're going to bring you back because we're hitting up against the 30 minutes. So the voice that you guys are listening to is Kim Iverson. She's an independent journalist and host of the Kim Iverson Show on YouTube. We will be, and on Rofkin, actually. We'll be back in a moment. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
Fault lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And here's the thing, Kim, we have you on for half an hour, split into two segments. I'm going to dramatically change subjects here because I pitched it earlier and it's also legitimately interesting. And it also has to do with, I saw on your channel, you were talking on your YouTube channel, youtube.com/Kim Iverson. I saw that you were recently talking about how you got a strike from YouTube, how they pulled a video of yours down. We're going to be talking about an article about comments made by YouTube CEO, Susan Wojcicki, I believe is how you pronounce her name. Comments that she made during the World Economic Forum's Global Technology Governance Summit in 2021. Now, I'm gonna read a little bit here, but one key thing to keep in mind here is that she is doing this while engaging in an interview, while being interviewed by The Atlantic, the publication The Atlantic CEO, Nicholas Thompson. So she's speaking with an establishment media outlet, a quote-unquote authoritative media outlet when she says this stuff. And this is a YouTube CEO. This is the person setting the policy agenda, laying out what they're going to do, how the company looks at things, how it's going to respond to things. And we're specifically talking about quote unquote disinformation, different types of media sources, citizen journalism versus establishment journalism. Anyway, without further ado, I'm just gonna read this briefly here. Quote, when we had the Las Vegas shooting, unfortunately, there were a lot of people who were uploading content that was not factual, that was not correct. And it's much easier to just make up content and post it from your basement than it is to actually go to the site and to be able to report and have high quality journalistic reporting. And so that was just an example of what happens if you don't have that kind of ranking. So sure, we want to enable citizen journalism and other people to be able to report and other people to be able to share information on new channels. But when we're dealing with a sensitive topic, we have to have that information coming from authoritative sources so that the right and accurate information is viewed by our users first. End quote. Effectively, the CEO of a company called YouTube, which ostensibly from its brand on down is giving anybody the right to speech on the internet, giving anybody a personal broadcasting platform, is going to, through its rankings, prioritize establishment sources when it comes to quote unquote sensitive topics. And we're talking about NPR retracting the story on Hunter Biden's laptop, coincidentally timed, maybe not coincidentally, on April 1st, where they retracted the claim that intelligence officials had debunked the story that Hunter Biden's laptop containing all this scandalous material, whether you're talking about drug use or sexual behavior and porn making or foreign dealings, all these different things. That came out on April 1st. And then within the last couple of weeks, you've had a variety of outlets, I believe, starting with the Daily Beast, but not necessarily, just a variety of outlets basically retracting claims, arguing that the Russian government had paid for bounties on American troops in Afghanistan. In other words, a couple of the biggest stories of the last year, one of which was systematically suppressed during the election cycle, the other of which was a big predecessor to it, again, used relentlessly to attack Trump for dismissing the story, which if it's discredited, the story is worth being dismissed. Both of these stories were huge stories in the last year, and yet mostly silently, they have been retracted. So my point that I'm making here, it doesn't actually seem like we can trust the establishment media. Now, on the other hand, I don't want to just trust somebody in their basement, but what I do want to give is, and what I do want to do is give people the ability, without filtration, without an inherent systematic bias in the code and the algorithms that present them with this stuff. I want to give people a chance to make up their own minds. Now, you're a YouTuber, you cover the news. Again, a video of yours was recently pulled down. You got a strike. Jamarl's channel was briefly demonetized a little while back, along with a wave of other people. It seems like there's a systematic suppression of alternative perspectives online. So I want to go to you on this, Kim. What was the video, if you can tell us, that was pulled down? What's the strike about? How do you feel about this? And how do you feel about the comments that Susan Wojcicki, the CEO of YouTube, was making here? What does that do to our society? Kim?
Well, did you know that Susan just recently won a Freedom of Expression Award?
Yes, I'm showing it now. I'm showing it on the channel. Right, a YouTube CEO wins Freedom of Expression Award, sponsored by, guess who, Shane? Who sponsored the award, Shane?
I mean, it's just such a joke. Yeah, YouTube sponsored their own award that they gave to her, their CEO.
Oh my God, really? It was,
yeah. Yes. I mean, just so stupid. So, I mean, it's just, look, I mean, we're becoming a one narrative nation, and that has got to frighten all of us. The fact that the powers that be are able to filter out stories and the same way China does. I mean, it's controlling the mass populations, and we see this country after country as populations grow. The large populations become threatening to the powers that be, and so what they try to do instead is, rather than allowing the mass populations to control their own futures, they instead start to try to control the minds. And the best way to brainwash people is through media. Yes, last night I even did a piece on COVID. There was a study done that showed in the United States, the COVID coverage, 86 or 87% of major news COVID coverage was negative in the United States, compared to other English language countries, which only had 50% negative, 50% positive. So the U.S. still focused on all the negativity during that time. And so then when people say, oh, this is all a control mechanism, and then you see a study like that where they were able to empirically prove it, it makes you wonder if there's some truth to that. Is this some sort of control mechanism to get us to all behave in a certain way? The video that I had removed which was ridiculous, was about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. All I did was actually repeat what was already in the news, which was that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine had been was being put on hold for potentially having side effects. And they said that was against their community standards, that they were only going to allow information that was authorized by the CDC and the WHO. And I'm sitting there like, I don't understand what I said really any different.
That's astonishing. That's astonishing, and that's so aggravating. Because basically you're saying, look, the virus has side effects that cause them to pause it. Like, because otherwise, why did they pause it? If it doesn't, like, if it had no side effects, it was entirely perfect. And if the only way that you could talk about it is it's magical, God created it, and it gave a halo around it when He created it, it's ludicrous. I mean, you should be able to be honest about a particular product. If you were mainstream media and you said the exact same thing, they wouldn't have given you another look, no glance, nothing. Because what I realized, the issue is not truth and lies. That's not it. The issue is not even whether something is farcical or ludicrous. The issue is whether or not they will be sued for it, or whether or not it will fall in line with political opinion. No more, no less. Meaning, if they're putting out the OPCW story, well, you have all of this contrary evidence saying that these guys cooked the books. Mainstream media doesn't touch it. Not only does mainstream media not touch it, mainstream media doesn't even want to acknowledge that the people who are on the ground is questioning the story. Like, they don't even, like, media doesn't even touch it. Meaning, the issue that these guys are pushing for the OPCW, they pushed one narrative, used that narrative to attack another country, and then buried it where media doesn't want to touch it. Now, what's true in the situation? Now, the reality of it is, what's true doesn't matter. What matters is, what is media going to put out? What is the prevailing narrative, etc. YouTube is perfectly okay with going along with the prevailing narrative, whether or not the narrative is true or false. It's just for them, it's a prevailing narrative. They're going to get more inventory dollars. They're not going to get lawsuits, or they're not going to get Congress pushing on them, especially if they're going in line with just corporate media. Meaning, this YouTube gets destroyed and sublimated in order to basically fall in line with the just network news model, just on the web. And it's horrendous, because if you do it, or if I do it, they shut us down. If media does it, no issue. So aggravating. That's so aggravating. The piece that you put, I've seen you far more on Rothkin than I have on YouTube. In fact, I didn't even realize you're still on YouTube. So what are you doing now? Like, has that adversely affected the way that you did your channel? Like, or is it, no, I'm going to diversify, and I'm still going to do my channel in the exact way I did my channel before? How has this affected you?
I've definitely changed the way I've operated on YouTube. And I don't put, now, especially after that, I realized, okay, I knew better, because when I was doing vaccine stuff or virus stuff before I got hit, I've had another video removed and I received another strike before. So I knew better, but I did it anyway. And I should have just remembered I can't talk about anything vaccine related on YouTube, or anything virus really related much, if it's really directly related to questioning the narratives at all about the virus or vaccines. But what was weird about that, I wasn't even questioning. I was saying, yeah, I agree. The CDC says that it's not maybe safe. And so here we are, after they've told us all these vaccines are safe, stop being an anti-vaxxer, everybody just take it. Yeah. And then now we see that there's, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, and it's like, how many more need to be recalled or put on pause before people realize, oh, these are experimental. But you can't even say that. So yeah, I've changed the way I operate on YouTube. I've moved, everything goes on Rockfin. Some stuff goes on YouTube. Everything goes on like my locals community. I mean, I've got I've diversified platforms in order to make up the revenue that I've lost from YouTube. Yeah. And so, that's all I can really do. I mean, what else can we do? Ultimately, YouTube's going to get rid of us. That's what they're trying. Right. They're trying to get rid of us. They're trying to sanitize YouTube to turn it into modern cable. But what I think they should do rather is, I would rather them just stick a label on all of us as opinion. Fine, but at least allow us to continue. And then I think the people that are our audience would understand it's the only problem with that is then, you've got all those people out there that would say, oh, well, that's just an opinion piece. That's just an opinion person. They don't know what they're talking about. When actually New York Times, Washington Post, Vox, all of them are opinion too.
Right.
I mean, they
have opinion sections. Yeah. And one more point to this, just real quick, 30 seconds real quick. A publisher versus a platform. How is this not indicative of a publisher? It seems that almost by definition, for her to say this, for her to make this argument, that, yes, we are getting rid of... We had the Las Vegas shooting. Unfortunately, there were a lot of people who were uploading content that was not factual, that was not correct. It's easier to make up content and post it from your basement than to actually go to the site, etc. But you have a lot of people who were going to the site. The cat from Status Quo, he was at the site. Ford Fisher, he was at the site. And what did they do? They shut his site down also. In fact, they shut his stuff down after using the content in mainstream media.
Like congressional hearings.
Yeah.
With status, I believe, with you literally using it in Congress, using footage that he took before taking it off the site, almost inexplicably. Kim, I want to go somewhere too, but what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, it is just a matter look, we're all screwed when it comes to YouTube and the fact that we're just unable to get real, it has nothing to do with truth. It has nothing to do with fake news or misinformation. And Jamarl, I mean, you're totally right. It has everything to do with them just covering their rear ends and staying in good graces. The elite staying in their elite circle, in the good graces of one another and scratching each other's backs. And this is how they do it. And in the end, the people suffer. We don't have information. Lack of information leads to an ignorant nation, and an ignorant nation leads to ultimately collapse. It's not in our best interest.
Well, that's kind of where I wanted to go with this, because I agree completely. But we also have had conversations on this show. There's a Noam Chomsky quote that I'm going to paraphrase, but basically, in a democracy, propaganda is the blunt cudgel that the government has to use. It's not violence, it's not force, and at least not in most cases. It's simply propaganda. It's setting out a narrative in the media to steer the public's opinion in a certain direction. So they'll vote your people into power. They'll vote for the policies you want. That kind of thing. Now, I have my own opinion on how you're supposed to deal with that. And I think that fundamentally, we live in a society that, at least nominally, is founded on the idea you have open conversations. Some people are reasonable, other people are unreasonable. But over time, if the conversations are open and there's this mutual self-education just through dialogue, people get to where they should go, and the society goes where it should go. And it seems like putting propaganda, it's putting the cart before the horse. The public should be steering where the government takes us, not the government steering what the public thinks so they can steer the government. But I can also admit there's another side to it. Any given state, if you're a democracy or even if you're the most authoritarian of governments, you want your public to think certain things. And it seems like the promise of an open society through the internet, the promise of an open platform for public conversation, it seems like that would pull the nature of government as we're used to it apart at its seams. How do you feel about that? And I'm sure this is something you've thought about. What do you think about that issue, Kim, before we close?
Yeah, I mean, there's always the risk. I think that when it comes to, you want your population to think certain things. And I think it can always work in one way or the other, right? You can either feed your population a bunch of misinformation, like I'm sure they get in North Korea, or you could give your population true information. And then if you give them true information, it might not be very good. And then you kind of worry about how your population is going to react to that. So I do think that it is kind of I understand the need to balance, because you especially don't want your population also to go down the hole of believing fake information, which we see all the time, all around the world. And here, right? Here in America, most of our population, I think, believes fake information. So, it's definitely a balance that I understand the issue and the nuance with it. But at the end of the day, I think that we've got to rely on each other to be able to make up our own minds with the information that we're given. I mean, we made it this far in society with crazy uncles giving us crazy rumors, right? Like everybody had that crazy uncle or that crazy neighbor who gave them crazy information. And then eventually,
I mean, heck, we're talking about vaccines. For a time, it seemed that the leading treatment was like leeches. And again, I mean, right. Maybe they work to some, limited degree, but it's like we have kind of bootstrapped ourselves up to higher levels. And I think a large part of how that happened, whether you're talking about science, specifically medicine, but just science in general, or the public discourse, philosophy, religion, even with the whole Protestant Revolution, whatever people's opinions about it, a lot of these processes have to do with opening up society to more conversation and more open communication between these different spheres of perspective and opinion. And it seems like, in a weird way, we are now contracting, systematically across the board over at least the last decade. And if you wanted to bring it back to Project Mockingbird or these other CIA attempts over the last half century, something like that, it seems like there's been this long-term attempt to contract what the public is able to say and to limit their means of expression unless it fits in with exactly that slotted narrative that you want them to take up. Kim, we've got to go to a break because we're taking calls on the other side. It was great to have you. It's been a little while. Thank you so much for joining us. Kim Iverson.
Thanks. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for being with us. For those listening, Kim Iverson, independent journalist and host of the Kim Iverson Show on YouTube. You can watch Kim's show again on YouTube at youtube.com/Kim Iverson. You can also go check her out on Rockfin at rockfin.com/Kim. That's right, just Kim. It's a privileged URL. It's a prestigious URL in their subdomain hierarchy or whatever you call it. Anyway, we've got to go to a break. We're taking your calls on the other side of this break. 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back with you on the other side of this short break. You're right back.
Fault Lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we are back, and we are caking your talls or taking your calls, as some people would like to say. 202-521-1320. Again, that is 202-521-1320. Our lines are now open. It is the wrap segment for today's show. That means this is your last and best chance to join us, not just this show, but this week. And I'm really just trying to draw this bit out just so that I can get more people to call in. 202-521-1320. We do have on the line Tarif from New Orleans. Tarif, let's go to you. How are you doing this morning? What's on your mind?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for taking my call. First, Free Journal and Science. I have two comments. I watched the space weather report by Tamitha Skov every week, and she go off of what she learned from NASA dealing with the radar system and stuff like that. We're supposed to be hit with another sort of flip coming on the 25th, which is Sunday. It's going to cause like minor problems with our satellite radios. I'm just throwing that out there. And my second comment is dealing with the UFO subject again. I believe, Jamarl, that UFOs are real. I wasn't knocking UFO sightings and abductions and anything like that. I feel to believe they are real, maybe not. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that you have a certain narrative that's being spent out there. And that narrative is that when I look at some of these certain like history channels and Discovery, and you have this certain type of element of like they're pushing a certain type of narrative of like a weaponization of space because they're afraid the aliens is here to invade, or the aliens is going to abduct a whole bunch of people, or the aliens this, or the aliens that. And what they're doing, they create a narrative of something that we really don't know too much about, of trying to spend more money on missile defense.
No, Tarif, I agree.
They want to weaponize, they want to weaponize space. But what it is, they're hiding behind that because they want to weaponize space not for aliens. They want to weaponize space for the Chinese and Russia. That's their main goal, just like they did in Poland. They're putting missile batteries down in Poland, right? Oh, this is for Iran, right? For the ballistic missiles. But why are you putting them in Poland, not in southern Russia?
Two things. Two things. The U.S., from my understanding, the Air Force, their stated objective was this kind of full spectrum dominance, like where this ability to be able to put a payload anywhere around the world, where if you could have something that's floating above, with a purely kinetic weapon that just goes and hits a particular target, well, that's game changer, right? Especially if you're the one that controls something like that. That's not even a nuclear weapon, even though it has a force of just monstrous. So I'm not necessarily against that. It's just, look, there are all sorts of things that are weird in this. It's all in the black, and because it's all in the black, it's just unknown almost by definition. And so, do I think some of it is us? Yes. I think some of these things are drones. I think some of this is black projects. Do I think some of it is not us? Yes. The catch is all of it's belief, because there's no way to nail it down, which is the terrifying aspect of the subject. I mean, Tarif, look, I think you're more right than not on this. I think because at the very least, I think you're trying to internalize what it means. And what it means is whatever the foreign conflict is. It's not like there's something going on in Ukraine. It's, all right, the Ted Cruz is telling you that something is happening somewhere else, and you just have to trust Ted Cruz for it. Or the Pentagon tells you that something is happening somewhere else. You have to trust the Pentagon on it. Like, it's that. And I'm sorry, that's monstrous. That's terrifying. That's terrifying. So, yes, I agree with you, Tarif, especially when it's, hey, we're spending $1 trillion, but that's not enough. We need to spend $2 trillion on weapons now because, there's something out there. Like, that's the way they're talking about it, this threat identification stuff. So, yeah. Let's go to the next.
Thank you for the call. Yeah, we got Michael calling in from Sydney. Michael, you were on the line. What's on your mind?
Yeah, hey guys. I just quickly like to talk about Iran and Russia and China, and it appears to me as though America doesn't really know what it's doing. I mean, you're suffering a severe case of imperial overstretch. You're spending something like 50 cents in every tax dollar goes on the military. They've always got money for the military, they've got for schools or healthcare or anything like that. And you're also spending more on your healthcare than the rest of the world does anyway, and it's meant to be the most efficient system, but it's not. And secondly, on the and you want to fight a three-front war? I mean, how's that going to work out? I mean, Hitler fought a two-front war. It got him, and everyone, and all that's another point of the Second World War. We got Anzac Day here in Australia, where we celebrate, all the diggers, as we call them, who died, but we were happy to march with the Japanese and the Germans and celebrate with the Japanese and the Germans. We weren't happy to fight with. We weren't happy to celebrate with the Russians and Chinese. China lost 38 million civilians and soldiers. Russia lost 27 million. They broke the back of the Chinese and the Russians, the Germans, not the Americans, not the Allies. And just on one quick point about the vaccines, I will take a vaccine when my country actually says I can take any vaccine in the world that is approved by the United Nations Health Organization. So I want to take a Russian vaccine, but I want to take a Chinese vaccine. I should be able to. We live in a free market economy, apparently, but I can't choose my vaccine. Why is that? Why don't I have the right to say, no, I don't want AstraZeneca?
Because we don't live in a free market economy. Globally, we don't live in a free market economy. That's been a popular narrative driven by specifically the American economic leadership, but no, of course we don't. No, whenever it suits us, we live in a free market global economy, but when it doesn't, we don't. And you can see that, even if we're talking about vaccines, that's not necessarily, pivotal to the world economy, hasn't been historically, but it applies too. It's what we call vaccine diplomacy. And the same thing with which countries we choose to work with, the offshoring of jobs, a whole thing with offshoring jobs to East Asia, specifically China, but these other countries on the periphery there. We wanted to strengthen our alliances with them. And so we made a targeted economic choice to work with them. It's not just because it's cheaper, because in a lot of ways it isn't. It's the alliances and the economic integration. That's the whole thing. Michael, thank you for the call. We have a couple more on the line, so I want to make sure we can get to them. You have Ingrid calling in from D.C. Ingrid, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Hi, Shane. On Biden, Obama, the reset, the alleged reset, whether they were working at odds, it's not uncommon at all for the country to state one thing but actually be pursuing other goals. Stated goals are not real goals necessarily. And Obama was in charge of what happened in Syria, what happened in Libya, the ridicule of the Sochi Olympics, all kinds of things. If he didn't know what was going on, then he's just incompetent. Moving on to Derek Chauvin, let me get this out of the way. I think what he did was wrong, and I would have been pleased with a manslaughter. But beyond that, I think that the police, the chief, perjured himself, saying that it was a felony, that he was not acting under police guidelines, because it was written in police guidelines what he did. Now, whether
that is true, whether it's common is a different.
Whether he was distracted by the crowd, whether he had malicious intent, whether he lost track of time, I don't know. It went on too long. He was guilty of manslaughter, sure, but this was perjury on the part of the police to throw him under the bus, to make it a felony so that he could be made guilty of that murder 2 charge.
Ingrid, disagree.
Thank you for the call.
I feel you, Ingrid. Fair enough. And look, I've said it on more than one occasion. The knee thing is common. Look, people. It's funny. I think we agree on this more than I think it sounds like just in retrospect. But you've heard me argue that this is common, that what Chauvin did was not uncommon, that the most weirdest thing in the world, he had his hands in his pocket because it was normal. The other cops didn't respond because it was normal. This notion of whether or not policing should have been on trial, yes, policing should have been on trial, but they isolated it to Chauvin and cut bait. Yes, I think he was guilty of murder. Whether it's a regulation issue, that could be debated.
Brave, we only got about 20, 30 seconds here, Brave, because we got to close this week out. But Brave, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Not enough time. I wanted to touch on something I brought up yesterday concerning the disconnect between how racism and what is considered racism is kind of misinterpreted, and there's a disconnect. But I just want to say have a good weekend, guys. I'll bring it up on a call Monday or something for next week.
Hey, thank you for that. Hey, everybody who called in, but Brave specifically, you two, please have a good weekend. Also, Ingrid, I didn't really comment here, but specifically on the first thing that you were talking about, what we do in the public, what the president declares the United States as doing, and what we actually do on the back end, often those differ dramatically. Although I will say, when Biden, as far as I can tell, when these comments came out, this was 2014, after the year of Ramadan, after the United States had cemented its position on Russia, effectively deciding on a new way. Now, maybe that has some precedent. Anyway, we need to close this show out. Thank you, everybody, for calling in and listening. Thank you to our guests. Thank you, Jamarl. We'll be back on Monday, signing off Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Have a great weekend, folks.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Another one is in the record books. I think I can still see Shane. Yeah, we can still see Shane. He's still in the background. So we use like this thing called OBS Ninja. OBS Ninja allows the system that I'm using to take video from the person and then kind of send it to my feed. And it's not really sending it to my feed. It's sending it. If I had to build the system, the way I would build it would be I would have control of some other kind of website. And so on that web page, I would have whatever content that I'm trying to send. So let's say if I don't want to send the image directly through Skype, what I might be able to do is send it to another web page. And then I could say, all right, from your OBS thing, go to this web page in order to appropriate this particular information, in which case you have a picture or you have a text or a document or whatever else, or a web page or display. And so it basically shows his information based upon the camera feed information that's being sent. It's pretty badass. It's pretty ingenious. Shout out to OBS. All right, I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say subscribe. You guys are going to see me multiple times today. We're going to get the news done, and I'll see you guys in a few. So thank you all for joining us. Brave, I am sorry we couldn't get to you at the end. Dude, call earlier. But I'm going to say like, share, subscribe, and you guys, if I don't see you, if you don't join me for the rest of the day, have a badass weekend.